My son took my truck, saying it was wasted, on an old man. Then the DMV called him. My son stood in my own driveway, spinning my truck keys around his finger, and he looked at me the way you'd look at a fence post that had outlived its usefulness, and he said, "Come on, Dad, that truck's wasted on an old man. You barely drive anymore. I'll take it." And he laughed. That's the part I keep coming back to, 2 years later. Not the words, but the laugh. Easy, certain. The laugh of a man who has already decided a thing is his and is just being polite enough to say it out loud before he takes it. He climbed up into the cab of the pickup I'd driven for 20 years, the truck I'd hauled hay in and pulled calves in and carried my dying wife to the hospital in. And he backed it out of my driveway and drove off down the county road with the window down and his elbow out, laughing, and I stood there in the dust and I didn't say one word. Now, a lot of you are going to hear that and think, "Earl, you old fool, why didn't you stop him? Why didn't you snatch those keys back or holler, or at the very least tell your own boy to go to hell?" And I'll tell you why. Because I have spent 78 years and my whole life on a piece of ground that will teach you exactly one lesson if you're paying attention. And the lesson is this: you cannot rush a thing. You cannot rush a crop. You cannot rush a storm. You cannot rush a calf that isn't ready to come. You wait. You let the season do what it's going to do. And you keep your hands steady and your mouth shut, and you let the land settle the account, because the land always settles the account, in its own time, whether you holler or not. So I stood in the dust, and I watched my son drive off in my truck, and I did not argue. But here's the thing my boy didn't know, the thing this whole story turns on, the thing that mattered more than any set of keys. That truck was still titled in my name. Every bit of it, on paper, was mine, and I had never once signed a transfer. Brett could drive it, sure. He could park it in his driveway and wash it on Sundays and tell his friends it was his. But on the one piece of paper that actually decides who owns a thing in this country, that truck belonged to Earl Tolliver, and it was going to keep belonging to Earl Tolliver until Earl Tolliver signed his name to say otherwise. And I hadn't, and I wasn't going to. 2 weeks later, the DMV called my son. I'd like you to sit with how much fear can travel through a man over one phone call from the Department of Motor Vehicles, because I saw it land on Brett's face when he came storming back up my drive, and it was a beautiful thing to see. Because Brett, it turned out, had done what men like Brett always do. He hadn't just taken the truck, he'd gotten greedy with it. He'd tried to make it truly his, tried to register it in his own name, tried to turn my truck into Brett's truck on paper, the same easy way he'd turned it into Brett's truck in the driveway. And to do that, he'd needed my signature on a title transfer. And he hadn't asked me for it because I might have said no. And because in Brett's mind I was a doddering old man who couldn't be troubled with paperwork anyway. So he'd signed it himself. He'd forged his own father's name on a state document. And he'd walked it into the DMV like it was nothing. And somebody at that counter, God bless whoever it was, had looked at that signature and looked at their records and picked up the phone. And now the Department of Motor Vehicles wanted to talk to Brett Tolliver about a possible fraudulent title transfer. And Brett was standing in my driveway the color of curdled milk, and I understood, in that cold, clear moment, 3 things at once. I understood that my son was willing to forge my name. I understood that if he'd forge it on a truck title, he'd forge it on anything. A deed, a power of attorney, whatever it took. And I understood, standing there being yelled at by my own boy over a phone call he'd brought on himself, that the truck had never really been about the truck. The truck was just the first thing he reached for. It was the tell. It was my son showing me, plain as a brand, exactly how he saw me and exactly what he thought was already his, which was everything. The truck, the equipment, the house, the savings, and the thing worth more than all of it put together. The reason a slick developer had started leaving cards in my mailbox: the land. 600 acres of Tolliver ground that my grandfather broke and my father worked, and I gave my whole life to. Sitting right where the town had finally sprawled out to meet it, worth a fortune now, to a man who wanted to turn my pastures into cul-de-sacs. That's what Brett was really reaching for. The truck was just him testing the gate to see if it was locked. He thought it wasn't. He thought the old man was finished, the gate was open, and everything behind it was there for the taking, wasted, as he put it, on an old man. What he never once considered, laughing in my driveway with my keys around his finger, was that my wife Della, God rest her, had spent her whole life making sure that gate was locked, and that the only key was in my name, on paper, where a forged signature couldn't reach. He never considered that the same law that had just put the DMV on the phone about a truck was going to be standing in my living room one day soon, about 600 acres. He looked at a grieving old rancher in worn-out boots, and he saw a man who'd been used up, wasted, ready to be carted off. He never once considered that he was looking at a man who had spent 78 years learning that the land keeps every account and pays out every debt exactly on time, and that the account on Brett Tolliver had just started coming due. Before I tell you what I found when I really started looking, and it went so far past a truck, all the way to a plan to have me declared crazy and sell the ground out from under me while I sat in a home 2 counties over. Let me ask you one small thing. Tell me down in the comments where you're listening from tonight and how old you are, because I've got a feeling some of you have been handed a version of that laugh, the "it's wasted on you" laugh, the "you don't need it anymore" laugh, the laugh of somebody who's already decided your life is theirs and is just waiting for you to be polite enough to hand it over. And if you've ever stood in your own driveway and watched someone drive off with a piece of your life like it was already theirs, do an old rancher a kindness and hit that like button and subscribe and stay with me to the end. Because this is the story of the day my son took my truck and told me it was wasted on an old man. And it's the story of what that old man's name on a piece of paper turned out to be worth. Stay till the end. The end is where he found out. Let me tell you what kind of story this is, so you know what you're in for from an old rancher. There's no shouting in it. I never raised my voice at my son, not once through the whole thing, not even at the end, not even when the law was in my living room and the truth was on the table and he was reaching for the door. Ranching breaks you of shouting, or it breaks you. You can't holler a fence into standing, or scream a drought into rain, or yell a sick animal well. The land doesn't answer to noise. It answers to patience and steady hands, and doing the right thing over and over whether anybody's watching or not. I worked that ground quiet for 60 years, and I worked this trouble the same way. I didn't fight my son. I outlasted him. I did the slow, patient, unglamorous work that beats a man like Brett every single time. Because a man like Brett cannot wait for anything. And a man like me has spent his whole life learning how. And I want to say one more thing about what kind of story this is, so nobody comes to it looking for the wrong thing. This is not a story about revenge. I know the title makes it sound like one. The old man gets his own back, the son gets his comeuppance. And I understand why you'd come for that, and there's some of that in it. I won't pretend there isn't. But revenge was never what I was after, and if that's all I'd wanted, I'd have gone about it a different and a worse way. What I was after was my land, and my daughter, and my grandson's future, and the truth laid out where nobody could ever call it a confused old man's imagination. I wanted to repair what could be repaired, and protect what could be protected, and let the law do the rest. A rancher's whole life is repair, not revenge. You don't get even with a broken fence, you fix it. You don't punish a drought, you outlast it and plan again. So, when you hear how this ends, don't hear it as an old man getting even. Hear it as an old man mending what could be mended, saving what could be saved, and handing on what was his to hand on. The comeuppance my son got, he brought on himself, every bit of it. I just stopped protecting him from the harvest of his own planting. There's a difference, and it matters. And it's most of what the land ever taught me. I didn't fight my son. I outlasted him. I did the slow, patient, unglamorous work that beats a man like Brett every single time. Because a man like Brett cannot wait for anything, and a man like me has spent his whole life learning how. But to understand how I came to be standing in my own driveway watching my boy laugh and drive off, you have to go back to the thing that hollowed me out enough for him to think he could. You have to understand Della. The house was too quiet without her, and a rancher knows quiet, but not this kind. Out here the quiet is a full thing, alive, wind in the cottonwoods, cattle lowing off in the west pasture, the windmill creaking, coyotes starting up at dusk. For 54 years, Della was the sound inside all that. The sound that made the ranch a home instead of just a place I worked, her radio in the kitchen, her humming while she snapped beans on the porch, the screen door slapping behind her 40 times a day, her voice hollering across the yard that supper was on and I'd best come in before it got cold. For 54 years I came in from the fields at dusk and heard Della before I saw her, and I knew I was home. Then the cancer came. They told us on a Thursday, in a little clinic in town, with a water stain on the ceiling I stared at so I wouldn't have to watch her face. And it took her from me over about a year, a piece at a time, and it was neither quick nor kind. And when she was gone, the ranch went quiet in the wrong way, a hollow way. And I moved through my own days like a man walking a pasture after the herd's been sold, out of habit, past everything that used to be alive. Grief does a strange thing to time, and a rancher lives by time, by seasons, by the calendar of a place, calving and haying and weaning and the first hard frost. But grief throws all of it off its hinges. Some mornings I woke before dawn out of 60 years of habit, ready to go check the stock, and reached across the bed for Della before I was even awake and found it cold, and lost her all over again, whole like the first day. Some evenings I set 2 plates on the table without thinking. I couldn't move her boots from beside the door, or her coat off the hook, or the last grocery list in her handwriting off the refrigerator where it still hangs. People tell you grief gets lighter with time. It doesn't. Your shoulders get wider, or they don't. And in those first months, my shoulders weren't wide yet, and my family watched me not manage it, and they made a calculation. They looked at a man too gutted to fight, and they decided grief had made me soft and slow and workable, and that the gate was open. And here's the thing they got exactly wrong, the thing people who've never really loved anybody always get wrong. A broken heart doesn't make you blind, not forever. Sometimes it's the very thing that finally clears your eyes, once the first storm blows through. And there's a harder truth underneath it, one Brett never once factored into his figuring. A man who has already buried the one person he could not live without has run clean out of fear. There was nothing left they could threaten me with. The worst thing that could ever happen to me had already happened on a Thursday, in a bright little room with a water stain on the ceiling. Everything after that was just weather. They were looking at a soft old widower in worn-out boots who couldn't be bothered to fight for a truck. The man standing in that dust, going quiet, going careful, going patient, was the most dangerous man in that county, and my son was too busy laughing to notice. I'll give you one night so you understand the man they thought they were dealing with. It was maybe 3 months after the funeral, and I woke around 2 in the morning the way I did every night then, reaching across the bed for Della before I was even awake, and finding it cold and losing her again. And I couldn't get back to sleep, so I got up and pulled on my boots and went out. Because that's what I do. I go check the stock when I don't know what else to do with myself. And I stood out there in the middle of the night under more stars than a town person ever sees, with the cattle dark shapes in the near pasture, and the windmill creaking, and the whole big quiet country around me. And I understood that there was nobody to come back into. For 54 years I'd come in from a night like this and told Della the calf was fine, the fence was fine, go back to sleep, and there was nobody to tell anymore. And I stood out there in the dark, an old man alone in the middle of 600 acres, and I said out loud, to the land and the stars and the empty house, I don't know how to do this, Della. I don't know how to be here without you. That was the man my son looked at and saw an opportunity. A man alone in a field at 2 in the morning. And I understand, in a cold way, why he thought it would work. A man that broken looks finished. What he never understood, because he'd never loved anybody the way I loved his mother, is that a man who's already lost the one thing he couldn't bear to lose has run clean out of fear. There was nothing left they could threaten me with. The worst had already happened on a Thursday in a bright little room. Everything after that was just weather, and I've stood out in a lot of weather. Let me tell you about the land and about Della, because you can't understand what my son tried to take unless you understand what it cost to hold and who really held it. The Tolliver place is 600 acres, and every one of them has a story, and most of the stories are hard. My grandfather broke that ground with a mule and a walking plow, and a stubbornness that killed him young. My father held it through the Dust Bowl years when the sky turned black at noon and the topsoil of 3 counties blew past the windows, and better men than him walked off their land and never came back. He held it, on nothing, on grit, and he handed it to me with dirt under his nails and a warning in his mouth. They'll always try to take it, son, one way or another, the bank, the drought, the slick men in town. And your only job is to still have it when you hand it on. I took that as gospel. I gave that land my whole life. And when I married Della and brought her out here, A town girl who'd never pulled a calf or canned a tomato. I figured I'd have to teach her everything. Instead, she taught me. Because it turned out the land wasn't the hard part. Holding on to it was, and holding on to anything, it turns out, is mostly paperwork and patience, and Della understood both better than any person I ever met. We started with nothing but the ground and the debt on it. Della kept the books at the kitchen table, with a pencil and a coffee can full of receipts, and she was harder than any banker who ever looked down his nose at us. I did the work you could see. The fences, the stock, the hay, the 60 years of dawn to dark. She did the work that kept us from losing it all, the mortgages and the notes and the taxes and the endless war of paper that a man can lose his whole life to without a single dry season. There were years that nearly finished us. There was a drought that ran 3 summers, and I sat at that kitchen table one night with my head in my hands. Sure we were done. Sure I was going to be the Tolliver who lost it. And Della came and sat beside me and put her hand on the back of my neck. She had a way of putting her hand on the back of my neck that steadied the whole spinning world. And she said, "Earl, your granddad broke this ground and your daddy held it through the Dust Bowl. You telling me a little dry spell is going to beat the both of us? It won't. We'll go slow and we'll go careful and we'll outlast it. The land always outlasts the dry years if you don't panic and sell. And we outlasted it. We always outlasted it. And the ranch grew, and it prospered, in the slow way a ranch prospers. Not in money you can spend, but in fences that hold, and herds that grow, and a place that gets more itself every year. We paid off the ground my grandfather broke. We added to it. We put 2 more generations of this county's ranch kids to work in our corrals, and taught them what my daddy taught me. And the truck, that truck Brett drove off in, I bought it 20 years ago. And it became a part of me the way a good tool does, the way a horse used to. I hauled 10,000 bales of hay in that truck. I pulled cabs in the headlights of it on freezing nights. I drove Della to town in it every Saturday for 54 years of Saturdays. And I drove her to that clinic in it on the Thursday they told us, and I drove her to the hospital in it at the end, and I drove home from the funeral alone in it. That truck wasn't wasted on an old man. That truck and I had buried the same wife. Let me give you just one memory of it, so you understand it wasn't sentiment, it was a life. The last good day Della had, near the end, when she was too weak for much of anything, she asked me to take her out to see the land one more time. Not the hospital, not town, just the land. And I lifted her into that truck, light as a bird by then. And I drove her slow all around the place, every pasture, down to the creek, up to the rise where you can see the whole spread laid out. And she didn't say much. She just looked, with her hand on the dash, taking it in, 54 years of our life spread out in the evening light. And at the top of the rise she said, "It's held, Earl. Look at it. Everything we built, it held." And I drove my dying wife around our land in that truck. And it was one of the best days of my life and one of the worst, both, the way the last good days always are. So no, that truck was not wasted on an old man. That truck carried my whole marriage, start to finish. I courted Della in trucks like it, drove our kids home from the hospital in one, and drove her around our land to say goodbye to it in that very one. My son looked at it and saw high mileage and an old-timer who wasn't using it hard enough. He had no idea what he was reaching for when he spun those keys and laughed. He never did. That truck and I had buried the same wife. But my son looked at it and saw a used pickup. An old-timer wasn't using hard enough, because my son has never in his life understood that the worth of a thing and the price of a thing are 2 entirely different animals, and that's the whole story, right there, and I'll come back to it more than once, because it's the root of everything that happened. By the time Della got sick, we had built something a lot of people would call rich, though I never once used that word, because it turned out to be exactly the poison that got into my son. The land, 600 acres, sitting right where the town's growth had finally reached it, worth more money than my grandfather could have dreamed if a man carved it up and sold it to a developer, and worth nothing at all if you understood what it actually was, which was home and history, and the one thing my family had managed to hold on to across 4 generations of people trying to take it. To Brett, all of it was a number, acreage, a sale price, an old man in the way. To me, it was Della, and my father, and my grandfather's mule, and every calf I ever pulled. Hold on to that difference. It is the whole story. It takes a man who has never built anything, or held anything, or loved a place, to look at 4 generations of ground and see only what it would fetch by the lot. But before I show you what they tried to do to it, you have to meet my children. Della and I had 2 children, and I love them the way you love your own, completely and without ever quite seeing them straight. One of them is the reason there was a developer's card in my mailbox and a forged signature at the DMV. The other is the reason I can tell this story at all. The older is Brett, my son, and I'll be fair to him because I'm his father, and I had a hand in making him. Brett was never stupid, and he wasn't born mean. What Brett was a boy who looked at this ranch, at the dawn to dark of it, the dirt and the debt and the dry years, and decided early that he wanted no part of it, and more than that he was better than it. He couldn't wait to get to town. He didn't want a life you build with your hands. He wanted a life you buy, and he wanted it fast. And he went into deals, real estate mostly, and some other things I never fully understood. And for a while, it looked like he'd gotten what he wanted, the big truck and the bigger house and the wife who matched. And then the last few years, it started coming apart the way those things do. Quiet, behind the nice truck and the nicer smile. By the time his mother got sick, Brett was underwater in a way you couldn't see from the road, and he looked at his father's 600 acres sitting right where the developers wanted to build, and he could not leave it alone. That ground could solve every problem Brett had. There was just one thing standing on it. Me. There was a moment, years before any of this, that I should have read for what it was, and didn't, because I still loved the boy I remembered. Brett was grown by then, doing well, or seeming to. And he came out to the ranch in a truck that cost more than I'd cleared in a good year, and he stood at the fence beside me, looking out over the country his great-grandfather broke, and he shook his head and said, "I don't get it, Dad. You're sitting on a gold mine out here. You could sell this to the right developer and never work another day. Why do you keep busting your back on it? Sitting on a gold mine." I looked out at that land a while, and I said, mild, "And do what then, son?" And he laughed like I'd made a joke, and clapped me on the shoulder, and went up to the house to see if his mother had any coffee. And Della watched the whole thing from the porch, and that night, she said a thing I turn over all the time now. She said, "You hear your son out there, Earl? He looked at 4 generations of this family holding this ground, and all he could see was the price a stranger would pay to pave it. He can't see the land. He's never once been able to see the land. A man who looks at everything you love and can only find the sale price. That man will one day look at you and find your sale price too. Watch him." Della saw it before I did. She always saw the people before I did. I told her she was being hard on the boy. She was right. She was always right. His wife is Amber, and I'll not spend long on her except to say she was the wind in Brett's sails, not a passenger, but a driver. A woman who wanted the life the pictures promised and did not much care where the money came from as long as it came. Whatever Brett reached for, Amber was behind him with both hands on his back, pushing. She's the one who first started saying, at family suppers, that it wasn't safe for me to be out here alone, that I was too old to be running a ranch, planting it gentle and watering it every visit. Brett was the engine, but Amber kept the fire stoked. My second child is Beth, my daughter. And here's the part I'm least proud of, because this part is my own doing. And it's the wound Brett used. Beth loved this land, loved it the way I do, in the blood, the one of my 2 kids who'd get up before dawn to help me calve and never once complain. And I always figured Beth would be the one to take the ranch. And somewhere in there, I leaned on her too hard, made it a thing she had to carry instead of a thing she got to choose. And when she was grown, she did what a strong person does with a thing that's become a weight instead of a gift. She made her own life. She became a school teacher, a few hours from here, married a good steady man, raised her kids, built something that was hers and not mine. And I, fool that I was, took it as a rejection, took it personally the way a proud man does. And there got to be a coldness between us that was mostly my fault. And after Della died, when Beth tried to come closer, called more, offered to come stay, offered to help me sort through everything, Brett and Amber got in between us. Gently, reasonably. They told Beth I was fragile, that I got confused and agitated when too many people were around, that it was really better if she kept her distance and let them, who were close by, handle everything. And they told me a matching set of lies about Beth, that she was too busy, that she had her own family to worry about, that she'd said she couldn't get involved and was happy to leave it to them. They stood between my daughter and me and told each of us a poison version of the other, kept Beth far away and in the dark, kept out of the house the one child who loved me, who didn't want the money, and who would have taken one look at their story about my decline and known it for a lie. That's exactly why they kept her away. The scheme couldn't survive the eyes of somebody who loved me and wasn't afraid to look. And then there's Wyatt, my grandson, Brett and Amber's boy, 16, and the light in this whole dark story. Wyatt is the one who started riding along with me the way Beth once had, the only one in the whole next generation who wanted the dust and the early mornings and the work. Wyatt has the hands for it, and the patience, and the thing you can't teach, the feel for an animal, the red of the weather, the love of a place that gets in you and won't come out. He'd ride in that truck beside me with his boots up on the dash and ask me 100 questions about the land, and I'd see his grandmother in him and his Aunt Beth in him and have to look out the windshield so he wouldn't see my face. Wyatt loved me, and he was ashamed of his father in the quiet, watchful way of a good kid stuck in a house that's gone wrong, and everything I did, when the time came to do it, I did with one eye always on making sure that what was coming for Brett never once touched Wyatt. Hold on to him. Because in the end, the land and the money and the truck were not the most important thing I had to protect. Wyatt was. And there's one last thing from before I have to tell you, because it turned out to matter more than all the rest of it put together. And it was Della's doing. Years ago, long before she got sick, Della sat me down at the kitchen table where she kept the books and made me do something that felt, at the time, like a lot of worry over a distant trouble. She'd watched a neighbor family torn to pieces after the old man signed his ground over to a son to save on taxes and lost every acre when the son went bankrupt. And Della had a rule, and she laid it out with her finger tapping the table the way she did when she meant it. The land stays in your name, Earl. All of it, in a trust that only you control. Not in the kids' names, not for convenience, not to make it simple later. Yours. And the real papers, the deed, the trust, the title to every vehicle, all of it, don't live in a drawer in the barn office where anybody can get at them. They live in a box at the bank, and only you hold the key. You be as generous with those children as your heart tells you. Help them, love them, give till it feels good. But your name stays on the papers, and the papers stay where only you can reach them. The day you sign away your ground is the day you find out what your kids really think of you, and by then, you're standing on somebody else's dirt. And then she said, "The thing I hear in my sleep now." She put her hand over mine on the table, and she said, "A man who signs away his ground signs away his grave, Earl. Keep your name on the papers. Promise me." I thought she was being dramatic. I did it to make her happy. And Della, 2 years in the ground, saved everything I had with that conversation. Because when my son made his move, he made it dead certain that everything was already basically his. He never knew that Della had built me a fortress before she left, and that the only key to the gate was in my head, where you cannot forge it, and in a bank box, where my son could not follow. I remember everything about that evening now, with the sharpness you only get looking back at the thing that turned out to be your salvation. The kitchen lamp, her coffee can of receipts, the way she took my hand off the table and held it in both of hers when she wanted my whole attention, not the half of it that was still out in the fields in my head. "Earl," she said, "you are the best man I ever met at reading weather and land and stock, and you are blind as a post about the people you love, and one day that's going to cost you if you don't hear me now." And she didn't just make me promise with words. Della never trusted words. She trusted the doing of a thing. She made me get in that very truck the next Saturday and drive with her to the bank in town, and with her own hands, not mine. She put the papers in the box, the deed and the trust and the titles, and she closed it, and she pressed the little key into my palm and folded my fingers over it and said, "This comes to you and nobody else. Not Brett, not Amber, not some lawyer one of them brings out to the house being helpful. The day somebody asks you real sweet where you keep your important papers, you remember this drive, and you keep your mouth shut and you smile." I laughed and told her she was talking like we had gold buried out back. She didn't laugh. She looked at me and said, "Earl, the ones who come to take your land never come looking like robbers. They come looking like family. It's the only way it ever works." I thought she was being dramatic. I did it to make her happy. And Della, 2 years in the ground, saved everything I had with that drive to the bank, because when my son made his move, he made it dead certain everything was already basically his. He never knew that Della had built me a fortress before she left, and that the only key to the gate was in my head, where you cannot forge it, and in a bank box, where my son could not follow. After Della died, Brett and Amber moved in, close, fast, and at the time, God help me, I was grateful for it. I'd spent my whole life on this ranch, and I'd never had much time for town or family suppers, and now, suddenly here they were, around all the time. Amber with a casserole, and Brett just checking on the old man, and I was a hollowed-out widower, rattling around a silent house at the end of a long dirt road. And I let that attention in the way a half-froze man lets in a fire, never once stopping to ask why the fire had shown up now, after all these years of being banked so low. It started gentle the way these things always do. Concern. Dad, you shouldn't be up on that tractor at your age. Dad, what if you fell out here alone? Nobody'd find you for days. Dad, this ranch is just too much for one man now. You know that. Amber worked the word alone like a whetstone, a little sharper every visit. She'd tell me so sorrowfully about old ranchers who'd had a stroke out in a far pasture and laid there till the buzzards came, about a man over in the next county who left the stove on and burned his house to the foundation, about how it just wasn't safe, wasn't responsible for a man my age to be out here running 600 acres by himself. She was building a world in my kitchen where an old man on his own land was a tragedy waiting to happen, and where the only loving, sensible thing was to be somewhere safe, somewhere looked after. She was laying track, months of it, toward a station I couldn't see yet, and Brett was laying track of his own toward the same station from the money side. Because Brett started helping, that's the word he used. He came to me a few months after the funeral, all concern, and said I shouldn't have to worry about the business end anymore, the leases and the cattle sales and the equipment notes and the taxes, that side of it, the paperwork side, the side Della had always carried. He said, "Let me take that off your plate, Dad. You've earned a rest." And I was tired and grieving, and the paperwork without Della was a cold and lonely mountain I didn't have the heart to climb, so I let him. I let my son start helping with the money side. I gave him access to accounts, signed him on to things, trusted him the way you trust your own boy, and told myself it was a blessing to have a child step up. And slowly, without my quite seeing it happen, I went from being the man who ran the Tolliver place to being a tolerated old fixture who got gently steered away from his own books, his own leases, his own life. And then came the truck, and I told you about the truck, and the truck was the moment the whole thing turned, because the truck was Brett getting careless. Up until the truck, he'd been careful, gentle, all concern. But the truck was him deciding he didn't need to be careful anymore. The truck was him looking at me and deciding, out loud, in my own driveway, that my things were wasted on me, and he'd just take them. The laugh, the keys, wasted on an old man. And if he'd stopped there, at just taking it, I might have let it go, grief and all, because it was just a truck and he was my boy. But he didn't stop there. He forged my name to make it his, and the DMV called him. And in that one phone call, the whole thing came clear to me. The way a landscape comes clear when the fog burns off and you see you've been standing at the edge of a cliff. Because I want you to understand what that forged signature told me, standing in my driveway watching my son sweat over a call from the DMV. It told me he was willing to forge, and a man who will forge his father's name on a truck title, a used pickup, a small thing, is a man who is absolutely going to forge it on a deed to 600 acres when the time comes. Brett had just shown me, for the price of a truck, exactly what he was and exactly what he'd do. And I did the only thing my whole life on that land had trained into me when I saw a storm building on the horizon. I did not panic, and I did not run out to meet it. I put my head down, and I got quiet, and I started to get ready. I told Brett, mild as milk, that the DMV business was surely just a mix-up, and he ought to go straighten it out, and I let him drive off still thinking I was a doddering old man who didn't understand what a forged signature even meant. And the second his taillights were gone down the county road, I went inside, and I sat down at Della's kitchen table where she used to keep the books, and I started to think the slow, cold, careful way you think when a bad season is coming, and you mean to still have your land when it's over. I want to tell you how I first knew, deep down, that something was rotten, because it didn't come from that DMV call, not really. The DMV call just confirmed a thing my gut had already been telling me for months. It came the way everything important has come to me for 60 years. From paying attention to the land and the animals and the small signs most people are too busy to read. A rancher lives by a kind of knowing you can't quite explain to people who've never worked a place. You learn to read weather in the way the cattle stand, to feel a storm coming in your knees a day before the sky shows it, to know a cow's going to calve tonight by something in how she holds herself, to spot the one animal in a herd of 200 that's gone off its feed. It's not magic. It's 60 years of paying attention with your whole body until the knowing sits below your thoughts, in your hands and your eyes and your gut. And ever since Brett started helping with the business, something had felt wrong to me. Not any one thing I could point to, just a wrongness, the way the air feels wrong before hail. The place felt off. And I'd learned a long, long time ago never to argue with that feeling, because that feeling has never once been wrong in 60 years. And the handful of times I overrode it with my head are the only times the land ever truly hurt me. So I started, quiet, to pay attention. And the first man who confirmed it for me was Ramon. It's a strange thing to start really looking at your own life after a long time of moving through it half asleep with grief. It's like coming back to a pasture you haven't walked in months and seeing all at once the things that have gone wrong while you weren't looking. A gate hung different than you left it. Tracks that don't belong, a section of fence somebody's been at. Little things, each one nothing by itself, that add up to somebody's been here. I started noticing the little things. A bank statement that used to come to the house didn't come anymore. When I asked, Brett said he'd had them switched to paperless to make it easier, and I nodded and I filed it away. Equipment I didn't recognize, and equipment I did recognize gone, and no clear word on either. Amber steering me, gently, away from the barn office whenever I drifted toward it, always with a reason. A checkbook that wasn't where I kept it. Strange trucks in the yard on days I was told to go into town. None of it was proof. All of it was tracks in a pasture. And 60 years of reading this land had taught me that when you see enough small, wrong things, you don't wait for the big obvious one. By the time the wolf is standing in the middle of the herd in daylight, you've already lost the calves. You read the tracks early and you get ready early, or you don't get ready in time at all. So I started, quiet, to pay attention. And the first man who confirmed it for me was Ramon. Ramon had been my foreman for 40 years. 40 years at my side, through every branding and every blizzard and every dry summer. A man more like a brother than a hired hand. A man who'd quietly run the whole outfit the year Della was dying, so I could be at the hospital. Ramon wasn't blood, which turned out to matter, because it meant Brett and Amber never once thought to watch him. In their minds, the hired help were part of the scenery, and Ramon was just the old foreman who came with the ranch. But Ramon had eyes, and Ramon loved me. And one evening out by the equipment shed, where nobody could hear, he took his hat off and turned it in his hands the way he does when something's eating him, and he said, "Lo, Earl, I don't like what I'm seeing. Cattle going to sale that I've got no paperwork for, and the money not coming back where it should. Equipment leases I never heard of. Brett's had men out here I don't know, walking the property lines with a fellow in a nice truck, pointing and measuring. And there's money moving off the ranch accounts that don't match a thing we've actually done. I've kept my mouth shut because he's your son, and it's not my place. But you're my brother, Earl, 40 years. And I'd rather you hear it from me than find out too late. Something's wrong with the money, and somebody's been measuring your land. Somebody's been measuring your land," Ramon said out loud, the thing my gut had been telling me for months. And here's where I did the thing that decided everything, and I want you to understand the discipline it took, because every hot-blooded instinct I had wanted to do the opposite. I did not drive over to Brett's and put my boot through his door. I did not call my son and demand answers. Because Ramon had just told me that my land was being measured for sale, and my money was being stolen by my own child, and a younger, hotter man would have gone off like a July grass fire. And a grass fire, out here, is exactly how you lose everything, the whole country, all at once. You don't fight a range fire by running at it screaming. You get ahead of it, cold and deliberate, and you cut the fuel off, and you let it burn itself out against ground you've already prepared. So I put my hand on Ramon's shoulder, and I said, "Thank you, brother. Now, do me the hardest favor I've ever asked. Keep seeing everything and keep saying nothing. Be the scenery they think you are. Write down what you see. Dates, cattle, the men, the fellow in the nice truck, all of it. and give it only to me. Can you do that?" And Ramon, 40 years, looked at me a long moment and understood exactly what I was asking, and he said, "You're not going quiet off this land, are you, Earl?" And I said, "No, Ramon, I'm going to do this the way we do a hard season, slow and careful, and we're going to still have the ranch when it's over." And for the first time since Della died, Ramon smiled. I want you to understand who Ramon was to me, because it's the thing Brett got most wrong of all, and it's the thing that beat him. Ramon came to the Tolliver place 40 years ago, a young man with nothing but a good horse and better hands, and he never left. And over 40 years he stopped being a hired man and became my right arm and something closer than most brothers ever get. He and I have pulled cabs together at 3 in the morning in a blizzard, laughing like fools because there was nothing else to do. He ran this whole outfit single-handed the year Della was dying, so I could sit at that hospital and not lose a single hour with her. Never asked for a thing, just quietly held my whole life together with both hands while I fell apart. When Della passed, Ramon was the one who found me out in the machine shed the next morning, not able to work, not able to do anything. And he didn't say a word. He just sat down on an overturned bucket beside me and stayed there the whole morning, two old men not talking until I could stand up. That's Ramon and Brett. Brett looked at that man, that 40 years, and saw furniture, saw a Mexican foreman who came with the ranch, part of the scenery beneath noticing, talked over him, around him, gave him orders in the tone you'd use on a stranger, never once imagined those quiet eyes were watching, and that quiet mind was counting. And that, right there, is the arrogance that undoes men like my son every single time. They cannot see the people they've decided don't matter. They walk right past the person who's going to bring them down, because that person is holding a rake instead of a checkbook. Brett measured my land with a developer, and never once thought to wonder what the old foreman thought about the men in the nice trucks walking the property lines. Ramon thought plenty. Ramon wrote it all down. And for the first time since Della died, Ramon smiled. Ramon confirming it was one thing. Stopping it was another. And I knew a foreman's notebook wasn't going to save my land. So the next morning, on a day I told Amber I was driving to town for feed, I made a phone call I should have made the day Della died. I called Fran Cutler. Fran had been our lawyer for 40 years. Not some slick operator from the city, but a sharp, plain-spoken country lawyer about my own age who worked out of a little office over the hardware store in town, who'd drawn up our trust with Della sitting right there at the table, who read every line and forgot nothing and could not be charmed or hurried. I'd let Fran drift after Della passed, let the space around me fill up with Brett and Amber and their people, the way you do when you're grieving and somebody else offers to carry the load. Calling Fran back was like walking out to a truck you thought had died and finding it turn right over. I told her everything, in order, plain, the way Della taught me to lay out anything that mattered. The business handed to Brett to help with. Ramon's notebook. The money that didn't add up. The men measuring the land, the developer's cards in my mailbox, the truck, and the forged signature, and the DMV. Fran was quiet a while when I finished. Then she said something I've turned over ever since. "Earl, I'm going to tell you this as your lawyer, and as somebody who's known you and Della for 40 years. What Brett's doing has a name, several names. Financial exploitation of an elder, theft, fraud. And that forged signature on the truck title isn't a small thing, it's a felony, and worse than the crime is what it tells us. He's willing to forge your name, and a man who will forge it on a title will forge it on a deed. But that's not the part that worries me most. The part that worries me is the developer, and Amber's whole campaign about you being unsafe and unable to manage. Because a nursing home or a guardianship isn't the end of their plan, Earl. It's the tool. You don't build a careful story about an old man being unable to care for himself and put a developer's cards in his mailbox out of love. You do it to get control. Legal, permanent control. They'll want you somewhere you can't interfere, and then they'll go to a court and try to have you declared incompetent and get themselves named your guardians, and once they're your legal guardians, they can sell that land right out from under you, and there won't be a thing you can do, because on paper you won't be a man who can do things anymore. That poor dad can't manage the ranch talk isn't gossip. It's the foundation of a guardianship petition. So, now you listen to me. And her voice went flat and hard, the voice of a woman rolling up her sleeves for a fight she was built for. Don't sign anything. Not one paper. Don't let them see you're awake. Keep being the tired old man they need. And let me start pulling this apart. But first, Earl, everything turns on one question. The land, the house, the savings. Whose name are they in? And where are the real papers? And standing at the feed store, payphone with the receiver against my ear, I felt the whole thing turn over in the dark, and I near about laughed, and it came out closer to a sob. In my name, I said. All of it. 600 acres, the house, every bit, in a trust that only I control. And the originals are in a box at the bank only I can open. Della made me do it years ago. She said, keep my name on the papers. A man who signs away his ground, signs away his grave. There was a long silence on the line, and then I heard Fran Cutler let out a slow breath. And when she spoke, her voice had changed. Earl, she said quietly, your wife saved your life, and she's been gone 2 years. If that land is in your name in a trust you control, and the originals are where only you can reach them, then your son can steal every loose dollar he can get his hands on, which is a crime, and we will nail him for it. But he cannot sell that ranch. He cannot touch the trust. The only way he gets that land is to have you declared incompetent and take you over legally. And that, Earl, that we can stop cold because you are not incompetent. You're sharper than the 3 of them put together, and we can prove it. But we have to find out everything he's already done, and we have to do it in total silence, because the second they know the old man is awake, they'll move faster than we can catch them. And standing there at that payphone, an old rancher with a receiver in his hand, I felt something I'd thought died with Della come back up out of the cold and catch, like an engine you'd given up on turning over. All right, Fran, I said, but I don't just want to stop him. I want the whole thing. The money, the plan, the papers, all of it, laid out on a table where everybody can see it, where nobody can ever call it a confused old man's imagination. And Fran, there's one more thing, and it's the most important of all, my daughter. Beth, they've kept her away from me with lies, told her I don't want her around, told me she can't be bothered. I need a way to reach my daughter that doesn't go through the 2 who are robbing me. And Fran Cutler was quiet a moment, and then she said, Earl Tolliver, that's the best idea you've had yet. A daughter who loves you back in the room is worth more than any lawyer when they try to sell a judge on your decline. Let's bring your girl home. Let's get all of it back. Let's do it right. I called Beth that night from the barn office after dark, on a phone Brett didn't know I used, so it wouldn't show up anywhere Amber could see. It was the hardest call I'd made since the one to the funeral home for Della, and harder in a way because that call was about a loss already finished. And this one might tell me I'd lost my daughter too, through my own stubborn fault. She answered wary, that careful, flat tone we'd both worn for years. The sound of 2 proud people who love each other across a fence one of them built. And I didn't give her the speech I'd rehearsed. I just told her the truth, plain, the way Della taught me. I said, Beth, for 2 years I've been told you couldn't be bothered with me, that you had your own life and didn't want to be pulled into mine. And I believed it, because I was grieving and it was easier than fighting for you, and because I was still nursing a hurt from years back that was mine, not yours. I've found out it isn't true. Your brother and his wife told me one thing and told you another, and kept us apart on purpose, because they've got their hands in things they can't let you see. They kept you away from me, girl. You didn't abandon your old man. Somebody talked you out of the room. And I'm calling to say, I know now, and I'm sorry, for that and for years back, for making this land a wall between us when it should have been the thing that held us together. I need my daughter, not the help, not first. First, I just need my girl to know her daddy never stopped wanting her. There was a silence so long, I thought the line had died, and then I heard Beth, my strong, level Beth, who taught a room full of 10-year-olds and didn't cry, start to cry, the deep kind, the kind of a person who's been carrying a stone for 2 years and just felt somebody lift it. They told me you were angry, she said. They told me you got upset when I called, that it was better for you if I stayed away. I stopped pushing because I thought I was hurting you, Dad. I thought I was staying gone for your sake. And that broke the last of the ice between us, and we cried together on the phone, my daughter and I, a few hours of dark road apart, and it was the true beginning of the mending. And then, because she's Della's girl to the bone, she wiped her face and her voice changed and got steady and sharp, and she said, okay, tell me all of it, from the start. And Dad, this business about you not being able to manage, I want every word they've said and who they've said it to. Because I have watched families do this to old people my whole life, good people made to feel crazy so somebody could take what was theirs, and it makes me sick, and I know exactly how the trick works, and I know how to take it apart. And I heard my daughter, 2 years lost and 1 phone call found, start to think, and I thought, they never should have let this one out of the room. Beth couldn't come running that week without tipping them off, so we did it careful. Calls after dark, a quiet plan, her coming when the moment was right and not before. But she was in it now, all the way, and having her back was worth more to me than the land and every dollar under it. And with Fran, over the next weeks I built the rest of the team. Fran brought in a forensic accountant, a patient, unhurried man named Gil Overby, who did this work for courts and lawyers and could make a set of books confess things they didn't know they knew. Ramon fed Gil the ranch's real numbers from the inside. Fran also brought in an investigator, a retired sheriff's deputy named Cass Buckley, who'd spent his last years on the job working elder fraud out here in the county. A big, slow-talking man with tired eyes and a way of going quiet that made guilty people fill the silence. And through it all, I kept my own eyes and ears open in the one place my son never thought to guard. My own land, my own corrals. The hands who'd been loyal to me for decades and whom Brett and Amber treated like fence posts, and who saw everything. The first time Cass Buckley and I sat down at Della's kitchen table with the curtains drawn, I told him I wanted all of it, and I slid a check across the table with the amount left blank. He looked at it, folded it once, put it in his shirt pocket without filling in a number, and said, "Mr. Tolliver, before I take $1 off you, I'll talk straight, because you strike me as a man who'd rather have it straight. When it's a stranger doing this to an old rancher, it's a case. I work it, I close it, I sleep fine. When it's the man's own boy, it's a different animal, and winning it doesn't stop it from hurting. I've watched tough old men come apart at the end of one of these, right when they ought to be celebrating, because what we turned up was worse than not knowing. So I've got to ask you before we start, are you sure you want to see all of it, everything your son's done?" I thought about the truck and the laugh and the developer's cards and Ramon turning his hat in his hands by the shed. And I thought about Della with her finger on the table, telling me to keep my name on the papers. And I thought about Wyatt in the truck with his boots on the dash, asking me 100 questions about the land, and I said, "Mr. Buckley, my son wants to sell 4 generations of Tolliver ground to a man who will turn it into cul-de-sacs, and put me in a home to do it. I've spent 60 years learning to read what's coming across this country before it gets here. No, I'm not afraid of what's inside my own boy. Open it up, all of it, every acre of it." He nodded slow, and something behind those tired eyes sharpened, and he said, "Then give me a few weeks, and Mr. Tolliver, keep being the tired old man who's about ready to give up the ranch. It's the best cover we've got." And I kept being the tired old man who was about ready to give up the ranch, all that fall and into the winter, and I'll tell you plainly, it was the hardest work of my life. Do you know what it costs a proud man? A man who broke horses and held 600 acres through droughts that ruined his neighbors. To sit at his own table and be talked over and take it, with the truth sitting in a folder in the next room. To hear Amber tell a cousin in that sorrowful voice how hard it was watching Dad slip, and to nod along, vague and confused, right on cue. To let Brett steer me away from my own barn office like I was a visitor who'd wandered somewhere he shouldn't be. To let my son drive my truck up the drive and never once let on that I knew about the DMV, the forgery, any of it. I bit through my own pride 100 times that winter. There was one supper I'll tell you about, because it was the worst of them. And getting through it was the hardest thing I did in the whole business. Amber had some of her family out, and she was performing the devoted daughter-in-law. And at one point, in front of everybody, she cut my meat for me. Cut it up on my plate like I was a child, cooing about how she just wanted to take care of me. And everybody made warm noises about what a sweet thing that was. And I sat there, a man who'd castrated calves and set fence posts in frozen ground and buried his own wife, and let my son's wife cut my food into little pieces in front of a table full of people. And I said, "Thank you, Amber, that's kind." And under the table, my hands were fists, because I knew exactly what that performance was for. It wasn't kindness, it was evidence. She was building a picture in front of witnesses of a helpless old man who needed his food cut for him, a picture she could carry into a courtroom. Every "let me help you, Dad," every cut-up plate, Every arm taken to walk me to a chair I didn't need help reaching was a brick in the case that I couldn't care for myself. And the discipline it took to let her lay those bricks, to help her build the very thing meant to bury me, knowing that every brick she laid in front of witnesses was one more brick I'd hand to Fran to prove premeditation. That discipline nearly broke me 100 times, but I let her cut my meat. I let her build her picture, because I was building one too, and mine was true, and the day was coming when both pictures would be laid on a table side by side, and everyone would see which one was real. I bit through my own pride 100 times that winter, but every time I wanted to break, to be the man I'd been for 60 years, to run the both of them off my land, I heard Della, slow and patient. We'll outlast it. And I thought about the difference between a few months of swallowed pride and the whole rest of Wyatt's inheritance and 4 generations of Tolliver ground. And I kept my face soft and my voice small and my knowing down in my gut where they couldn't see it. It's the patience of the land that wins these things. You put the seed in the cold ground in the dark of the year, and everyone who doesn't farm swears nothing's happening. And all the while, down where nobody can see, the root is taking hold. I put my son in the cold ground of my patience, and I waited for the root to catch. It took Gil Overby and Cass Buckley and Ramon the better part of 2 months to lay the whole thing out flat. And when they finally did, one night at Fran's office over the hardware store with the blinds drawn, it covered the table. Let me give it to you the way they gave it to me. In layers, each one worse than the one before, because that's how betrayal really shows itself. Not all at once, but one furrow at a time, each one cutting deeper than the last. The first layer was the money, and it was theft, plain and cold, dressed up as helping Dad with the business. Now, thanks to Della, the real prize, the land, the trust, the protected savings, Brett had never touched and couldn't, because it was in my name and locked where only I could reach. But the cash he could get at, he had bled with method. Gil unrolled it, thread by thread. Brett, through the access I'd trusted him with, had been selling cattle and pocketing the money, running equipment leases I'd never agreed to, and skimming the difference, moving money out of the ranch operating accounts into accounts that led, when Gil followed them far enough, back to Brett, some of it going to keep his sinking deals afloat, some to Amber for the house and the appearances, some just vanishing into the hole that men like Brett can never fill no matter what they pour in. They'd drained the operating cash, run up debts against the outfit, and quietly hollowed the working ranch from the inside while I shuffled around being managed, and laid out flat on Gil's spreadsheets with the dates it turned your stomach to look at. And then Gil came to the dates, and his voice got careful, the way a decent man's voice gets careful when he's about to hand you something that's going to hurt, no matter how gently he sets it down. Because the first movements, the first quiet skims, the first cattle sold off the books, the first test transfers off the accounts Brett had wormed onto, didn't start after Della died. They started before. They started the week of her diagnosis. That Thursday, in the little clinic. That same week, while I was learning to count my wife's breaths, my son had looked at his mother's death sentence and heard a starting gun, and he'd begun, small, careful, testing how much he could take and whether anyone would notice. While his mother was dying and his father was breaking, Brett was measuring the land. There is a cold in a person that runs deeper than any hatred, and I had the proof of it in front of me, dated in Gil Overby's neat hand, and it aged me 10 years and an hour, because here's the thing I finally understood. Sitting with those dates. Wasted on an old man wasn't just a mean thing Brett said in a driveway. It was a whole creed, a way of seeing, and once I heard it plain, I could see it running under everything he'd done. To Brett, a thing had worth only in the moment it could be turned into money and spent. A truck sitting in an old man's yard, not being flipped or upgraded, wasted. 600 acres of grass and cattle, not carved into lots and sold, wasted. A life's work you keep instead of cash out, wasted. And an old man himself, once he's done earning and started only costing, taking up a house and a piece of ground, somebody younger could be monetizing. Wasted, and worse than wasted, an obstacle. It's a way of looking at the world where nothing has value except what it fetches, and where a person who's past fetching is just in the way. And the terrible clean logic of it is that once you see people that way, everything Brett did makes a cold kind of sense. Of course you take the truck, it's wasted. Of course you sell the land, it's wasted. Of course you file the old man away somewhere and get on with turning his life into money. He's wasted, and he's the last thing standing between you and the cash. I don't think Brett ever felt like a villain, not for 1 minute. In his own head, he was just being efficient about assets that were being wasted, and one of those assets happened to be his father. That's not a monster. That's something colder and more common than a monster. That's a man who learned to price everything and value nothing. And there are more of them out there than any of us wants to know. I sat with that a long time. Nobody in the room said a word. They let me sit in it. And when I could talk, I said, "All right, that's the money." But the money was never the whole plan, was it? The money was just what he could grab while he set up the real thing. Show me the real thing. Show me what he means to do with me, and with the land. And Cass Buckley, quiet in the corner, leaned forward, opened a second folder, and said, "This is where it gets bad, Mr. Tolliver, because the money's just the seed money. What he's really been building is a way to take all of it, and to put you somewhere you can't stop him. And he's close to done building it. The second layer was the plan, and this is where it stopped being simple greed and became a machine. A patient, ugly, step-by-step design to take 4 generations of Tolliver ground and file me away in a home 2 counties over. Cass laid it out in order. Brett was drowning, and the land was the life raft. 600 acres a developer wanted bad, sitting right where the town had grown out to meet it. Cass had the developer's name, a man named Grady Voss, who put up subdivisions and who'd already had his people out, walking my property lines with Brett, already had a number sketched out, already had a plan on paper to carve my grandfather's ground into 140 house lots and call it something with the word ranch in the name, the way they always do, selling people the feeling of the thing they paved over. But the land wasn't Brett's to sell, and the cash he could skim was a trickle next to the flood he wanted, and every dollar of it could be traced, as he was about to learn. What Brett needed was the whole thing, legally, permanently, with no stubborn old man in the way. And there was only one road to that, and he was far down it. The plan had 3 moves, and Cass had documented all 3. First move, get me off the land and into a home. Amber's whole, "It's not safe for Dad out here alone" campaign, where I'd be isolated, dependent, cut off from Ramon and Beth and anyone loyal, easy to control and easy to discredit. Second move, a guardianship. Through a lawyer of Brett's, a slick operator named Rex Marlowe, who did this kind of elder work, they were preparing to petition a court to declare me incompetent to manage my own affairs and appoint themselves my guardians. And to do that, they needed proof of my decline, which is what the whole 2-year performance had been for. Every stage forgetting at a family supper, every "poor dad can't keep up anymore" told to a cousin or a neighbor, every worried word about the old man alone on the ranch. All of it was evidence, manufactured and seeded for the day they stood before a judge and said, "Our father cannot care for himself. Look, he can't even run his own place. Here's a doctor's note. Please put us in charge." And they had the doctor, a Dr. Slade, an acquaintance of Marlowe's, willing to sign a soft hedging note about cognitive decline, based not on any real examination of me, but on what Brett and Amber told him, a signature for hire dressed up as medicine. Third move, once the guardianship was theirs, sell. Sign the land over to Voss, close the deal, carve up the ground, and leave me in a home, paid for out of my own stolen money, wrapped in the language of love. He's safer there. It's what's best for Dad. The ranch was just too much for him. We did it because we love him. The exact same words used to make more old people disappear than any of us will ever know. 3 moves, my money, my land, and me. I want to stop on that a moment, on the home they'd picked, because Cass had the name of it, Cedar Springs, and had even, being thorough, driven out to look at it. And it wasn't some snake pit. It was a clean, pleasant, expensive place with nice landscaping and a piano in the lobby, and that's exactly what made it so cold, because they weren't planning to be cruel to me. That's the part people misunderstand about how this is really done. They weren't going to lock me in an attic. They were going to put me somewhere clean and pleasant, with a piano in the lobby, and pay for it with my own stolen money, and tell everyone, tell themselves, that it was the loving thing, that Dad was safer there, that the ranch had just gotten to be too much for him. They'd visit it first for the look of it, and then, in Brett's own words, they wouldn't even have to drive out much. And I'd have sat in that pleasant place with the piano, a competent man declared incompetent, cut off from my land and my foreman and my grandson. watching out a window while somebody paved my grandfather's ground, and everyone would have said what a nice place it was, and what good children I had to arrange it. That's the cruelty of it. It doesn't come dressed as cruelty. It comes dressed as a piano and a nice lobby and the word safe. It is the exact same words used to make more old people disappear than any of us will ever know. 3 moves: my money, my land, and me. And here's the beautiful thing. The thing I turned over in that room, like a piece of ground I'd worked 1,000 times and suddenly saw fresh. The whole plan was impossible. Every single move depended on things that could not happen. Getting me into a home didn't give him the land. The guardianship was the only thing that could give him the land. And the guardianship needed a judge to declare me incompetent, and I was not incompetent. I was sharp as a new-honed knife, and now I knew it and could prove it, with a real doctor and a daughter who taught school and a whole county who'd known me 60 years. And even the home was to be paid for with money he was never going to keep. My son had built a 3-move machine to take everything, and not one of the 3 moves could actually work. And the reason was that a woman 2 years in her grave had sat me down at a kitchen table and made me keep my name on the papers. He was throwing himself against a locked gate, harder and crueler every month, right up to forging my name and calling the developer, never once understanding that the gate wasn't stuck. It was locked, and an old rancher had the key. I've thought about it since as a machine, one of those big combines, all that power and all those moving parts, throwing itself into motion with a terrible noise. Brett had built himself a magnificent machine. The isolation, the rumor, the bought doctor, the lawyer, the developer, the guardianship petition, the whole 2-year contraption engineered to take everything I had. And he threw the switch and it roared to life, all that greed and cunning spinning at full speed. And it wasn't connected to anything. It had no purchase. It was a great machine running flat out in empty air, because the one thing every single part of it needed to grab onto was a title, a deed, control of the land. And every one of those was locked in a box at the bank with only my name on it and only my key to reach it. He could run that machine as hard and as long as he liked. It was never going to bite into anything, because a woman 2 years dead had made sure there was nothing for it to bite. He was a man sawing furiously at a chain that wasn't there, sweating and straining and getting nowhere, while the actual gate stood quietly locked a few feet away, and the only key was in the pocket of the tired old man he'd written off. But Cass wasn't finished, and the last things he put on the table were the 2 that took the air out of the room, and they turned this from a family disgrace into a stack of felonies. Because Brett and his lawyer, impatient, unwilling to wait for a slow old man to sign, had already started forging, and the truck was just the practice run. Cass had found a document, drawn up and ready, purporting to transfer the ranch itself, with a place for my signature that Brett clearly meant to supply the same way he'd supplied it on the truck title, by writing it himself. The truck forgery wasn't a one-time thing. It was Brett testing whether forging his father's name would work on a small thing first, before he tried it on the big one. And the second thing was the shape of the whole endgame. They were getting impatient enough that Cass believed they'd try to force the last pieces soon, at a family gathering where they could get me to sign in front of witnesses or, failing that, manufacture what they needed. And Cass Buckley, who'd spent his last years on the job working exactly this, listed the crimes for me one by their right names: financial exploitation of a vulnerable elder, theft, fraud, forgery, and the attempt to strip a competent man of his freedom and his land through a false guardianship. And then he said, "Mr. Tolliver, this stopped being about getting your money back a while ago. These are serious crimes, several of them. It's time we brought in somebody with a badge." There was one more thing Cass found, and he brought it to me the way a decent man brings you the worst thing, quiet apart from the others, because some things have to land in private. It was my son's own words. There were messages, a thread between Brett and Amber, and some between Brett and a fellow who turned out to be one of Voss's people, and Cass had them through channels I didn't ask about, and the law later got its own proper way. And I am not going to read you all of them, because a father has some pride left even at the bottom of a thing like this. I'll read you the ones I carried folded in my shirt pocket over my heart for weeks. My son wrote to his wife, "Relax. Once we get the guardianship, the land sells, and every problem we've got disappears. He's too far gone to know the difference. Half the time, he can't remember what year it is. Slade will sign whatever we need, and Marlowe says the petition's solid. Just keep the poor dad's story going. The truck was nothing. That DMV thing'll blow over. Nobody's going to prosecute a son over a pickup. And Amber wrote back, I know. Honestly, it's kinda sad how easy he is now. He just goes along with whatever. But he's had his whole life out there in the dirt, Brett. It's our turn. That ground is worth a fortune, and he's just sitting on it, playing rancher. It's wasted on him. It's wasted on him. There it was again. The same words Brett said in the driveway. The family creed. And then the line that ended, in my head, whatever hope I had left about who my son had become. Brett wrote back, exactly. It's all wasted on him. Once he's at Cedar Springs and the deal closes, we're set. And honestly, we won't even have to drive out there to see him much. It's all wasted on him. We won't even have to drive out there to see him much. In their own words, about the man who taught them to ride, who pulled them out of 100 scrapes, who worked 60 years of dawn to dark so they'd have a place in the world. I sat with that a long time in Fran's office, and I'll tell you honestly what I felt, because it wasn't what you'd expect. First, God help me, I felt a terrible grief. For the little boy Brett had been once, riding in that truck beside me with his boots on the dash, before whatever this was got into him. And then the grief burned off, clean and total, the way it burns now. And what was left underneath was the cold, clear, quiet thing. The thing 60 years on the land builds into a man. The thing that can read a storm a day out and doesn't flinch when it comes. And I folded that paper and put it over my heart, and I said, all right, Della was right at that table all those years ago. And now, Cass, there's one more thing I need, the most important of all. My daughter, Beth. It's time to bring her home. Really home, here, where those two can't see it coming. Can you help me do that clean? And Cass Buckley looked at me a long moment with those tired eyes, and one corner of his mouth moved, and he said, Mr. Tolliver, bringing the good ones home is the only part of this job I ever liked. Consider it done. And Beth came home, quiet. The week we set the trap, and Fran and Cass brought her in without a whisper reaching Brett or Amber. And the moment she walked into that kitchen and I saw my daughter's face for the first time in 2 years, we both just stood there and then held on to each other and didn't say anything for a long while, because some things don't need words. They need a daughter's arms around your neck after 2 years of somebody else's lies keeping them off you. And then, the way it always was with Beth, she wiped her face and got to work, because she's a doer, my girl, the same as her mother. That first night home, she sat down at Della's kitchen table, the same lamp. And she pulled Gil's spreadsheets and Cass's folders toward her and started reading, a school teacher's finger moving line by line. And every so often she'd stop and ask a sharp question that even Gil hadn't thought to ask. And somewhere past midnight she set it all down and looked around that kitchen, at her mother's grocery list still on the refrigerator, at the coffee can of receipts on the shelf, and she got quiet, and she said, You know what makes me the maddest, Dad? Not even the money. It's that they use Mom's death as the starting gun. They looked at her dying, and they saw their opening, and they use me being gone, me being hurt and staying away, as part of the plan. They needed me out of this room, because they knew I'd have seen it in about 5 minutes. So really they stole 2 things from you. They stole your money, and they stole your daughter on purpose, to do it. And she reached across that table and took my hand in both of hers, exactly the way her mother used to, and I about came apart, because for a second it was 54 years of Saturdays and Della's hand on mine, and it was my girl home at last, both at once. Well, they don't get me anymore, Beth said. I'm home. Now, let's get your land back. And I have to tell you about Wyatt, because Wyatt is the reason I did all of it the slow, careful way, instead of just running the both of them off my land. And because of one afternoon in the West pasture, I'll keep as long as I've got a mind to keep anything. Wyatt rode out with me to check the stock, the way he still did when his house got too heavy, 16 years old and too quiet, a boy tiptoeing through his own life. And we sat on the tailgate of a ranch truck, looking out over the country his great-great-grandfather broke, and after a while, not looking at me, he said, Grandpa, can I ask you something, and will you tell me the truth? Are Dad and Mom trying to take the ranch? Are they going to put you in a home and sell it? And I looked at that boy, my Wyatt, and I had a choice to make, and I made it the way I hope I made most of the ones that counted. I didn't lie to him. But I didn't drop a 16-year-old into the middle of a war with his own father, either. I said, Wyatt, there are hard things the grown-ups have to sort out, and some of them are going to hurt, and I won't tell you they won't. But you need to hear the most important part, and I want you looking at me when I say it. And he looked up, his grandmother's eyes in his young face, and I said, Whatever your father's done, and we're going to leave what he's done to the grown-ups, none of it is yours to carry. You hear me? You don't inherit a man's wrongs, not the fault, not the shame, none of it. You're your own man. And what you are is a good, honest kid with the best hands and the best feel for this land I have seen since your Aunt Beth. And that's worth more than every acre and every dollar under it. Whatever happens to this family, you and I are solid as bedrock. You'll always have a place with me, and a place on this ground for as long as you want one. And that watchful boy, who'd been holding himself together alone in a house going wrong longer than any kid should, put his head down and his shoulders shook, and I put my arm around my grandson on the tailgate of that truck, looking out over 4 generations of Tolliver ground, and thanked Della and God that at least one thing in the next generation had come up straight and true, with a feel for the land and a conscience both. There was one night that winter, in the middle of all the trouble, that I'll keep alongside the best nights of my life. A heifer was calving, and it had turned wrong, a hard pull, the kind that can lose you both the cow and the calf if you don't know what you're doing and lose your nerve. And it was just Wyatt and me, past midnight, out in the calving shed in the cold, and I could have called Ramon. But I looked at that boy and decided it was time. I talked him through it. I put my hands over his hands and showed him how to feel for the legs, how to know which way the calf was lying, how to wait for the cow's own push and work with it instead of against it, how to pull steady and slow and never yank, because you cannot rush a thing that's ready to come only when it's ready. Wyatt was scared, his arms shaking, sweat on him in the freezing shed. And he said, Grandpa, what if I do it wrong? What if I lose it? And I said the thing my daddy said to me 40-odd years back in that same shed. I said, You might, that's the work. You do it as right as you know how, slow and steady, and sometimes you lose it anyway, and you learn, and next time you're a little less likely to. That's not just calving, son. That's everything. And that calf came, slick and steaming into the cold, and Wyatt cleared its nose and rubbed it down with a feed sack until it shook its head and drew its first breath, and the look on that boy's face, the look of a kid who just pulled a living thing into the world with his own 2 hands. I would not trade that look for all 600 acres. His father, at the same age, wanted to be anywhere but that shed. This boy wept a little over a live calf at 1 a.m. and didn't care if I saw. That's the whole difference between them, right there, and it's the difference that decided who'll have this land. Now, my Beth isn't a nurse or a doctor, but she taught school for 25 years, and there is nobody on this earth better at telling the difference between a person who's actually struggling and a person somebody's decided to write off, because she spent a career catching kids the system had given up on and proving they were sharp as anybody. And she looked at Dr. Slade's soft, hedging note about my cognitive decline, the way she'd look at a lazy report that had labeled some bright kid slow, and she got that flat, dangerous calm she gets, and she said, Dad, this is garbage. There's no real testing in here, no dates, no baseline. This is a man who never sat with you writing down what Brett told him to write. You know what we're going to do? We're going to get you the real thing. And she found the doctor herself, a straight-shooting geriatric specialist a few hours off who couldn't be bought, and she drove me there herself and sat in the waiting room like the daughter she was, and I spent the better part of a day answering every question and doing every test they had. And at the end, that specialist put it in writing, black and white, unshakable. Earl Tolliver is fully competent, fully oriented, entirely capable of managing his own affairs and his own land. I built, in other words, the exact opposite of the file my son had spent 2 years assembling. He had a bought note and a seated rumor. I had a real specialist and a daughter and the truth. And Beth folded that evaluation and looked at me and said, Let them try to put you away now. Let them just try. Della's girl to the bone. While I was quietly rebuilding my family and my case, my son was doing what impatient, greedy people always do when they think they've already won. He got careless, and he got cruel, and he got fast. Voss was pushing for a date, and Brett's deals were burning down around him, and the pressure made him sloppy, and sloppy was exactly what I needed. He stopped hiding it, now that he was sure I was finished. He talked about the land on his phone in my own kitchen, not bothering to lower his voice. Clear title by spring. He talked about me in the third person while I sat right there. He brought Voss himself out to the ranch once, walked him right across my home pasture, the two of them pointing and figuring, and introduced him to me as a friend. And the man looked at my grandfather's ground with the flat, appraising eyes of somebody seeing streets and lots where the grass was, and shook my hand. And I smiled and shook his, and thought about the deed locked in a box at the bank with my name on it that this man would never, ever get his streets onto. They had already sold it, in their heads. They were just waiting on a signature and a judge. It never once occurred to them that the signature was a locked gate, and the gate was me, and I was about to let them run into it at a full gallop. Because while they sprinted, I did the slow, patient, unglamorous work that actually wins these things. The work my son never had the discipline for. First, there was the quiet business of stopping the bleeding, and I did that with Ramon and Fran, and it was one of the most satisfying weeks of the whole thing, precisely because it looked like nothing at all. Brett had wormed his way onto accounts and leases, sure, but it was still my ranch, my name the only one that truly counted, and an owner who's wide awake, with his lawyer on call and his 40-year foreman feeding him the truth, can do a great deal without anyone seeing his hand move. Quietly, we closed the doors Brett had been carrying the money out through, tightened the leases, stopped the off-the-books cattle sales so that Brett's easy skim started mysteriously to dry up, and he couldn't for the life of him figure out why. I've thought about that often since. Brett checking his hidden little pipeline, finding it running slower and slower, baffled, never once guessing that the doddering old man he was about to warehouse had simply ridden out across his own land in the dark and shut the gates. And with Fran, I locked down the estate for good. A real arrangement read to me line by line, the way an honest person does it, doing exactly what I wanted and shutting out exactly who I wanted, built on the bedrock of the land in my name that they'd never been able to touch. I made a new will, a real one, with Fran reading me every word, the very thing they'd spent 2 years making sure never happened. I had my real, ironclad competence evaluation in hand. And with Fran and Cass, we took the whole machine, the stolen ranch money, the forged truck title, the deed they'd drawn up to forge next, the guardianship scheme, the bought doctor, the developer, the plan to warehouse a competent man on his own dime, and we brought it to the people whose job it is. Adult Protective Services opened a file, and a financial crimes investigator with the county, a sharp, unhurried woman named Rhonda Sykes who'd seen far too much of exactly this, spent weeks walking back through every date and document Gil and Cass and Ramon had assembled, and by the end, she had what she needed. She had the theft. She had the forgery. A real, filed, provable forgery on that truck title, which turned out to be the loose thread that unraveled the whole coat. She had the false medical note, and my real one beside it. She had the developer and the guardianship petition. And she had, cleanest of all, my son's own written words about warehousing his father, and selling his grandfather's land because it was wasted on him. And, like nearly everyone who came into this story, Investigator Sykes had a certain quiet interest in being present when it all got said out loud. Everything was ready, the estate, locked, my competence certified, Beth, home, Ramon, watching, Fran, Gil, Cass, Sykes, and APS, ready. Wyatt, protected, and kept clear of what was coming. The evidence, complete and verified. All that was left was to choose the ground and the moment, and my son, greedy heart and all, was about to choose it for me. Because Brett and Amber, impatient to close, announced they wanted the whole family out to the ranch for a Sunday supper, to talk about the future, and to get some paperwork handled so everything would be settled and easy. I knew exactly what that paperwork was, and I decided that my table, in my house, on my land, at their Sunday supper, was exactly where I would settle this account. All I had to do was wait, and a rancher knows how to wait. I set the bait, and I made it out of the one thing my son couldn't resist, my surrender. A few days before that Sunday, I told Brett I'd been thinking, and he was right, that the ranch had gotten to be too much for me, that maybe it was time I let him handle things proper and move somewhere I'd be looked after. I said it in my smallest, most tired voice, an old man finally giving up, and I watched my son's face open up like a gate swinging wide. I told him I wanted to do it right, all at once, as a family, and that I'd ask Beth to come. So nobody can ever say your old dad did anything behind anyone's back. And that pleased him, Beth there to witness the old man handing it over of his own free will. It slammed the last door on any trouble down the road, or so he figured. "That's the right thing, Dad," he said, warm as I'd heard him since Della died. "It really is. Mom would be proud of you." Mom would be proud of you. My son said that to me, greased to slide the last of it over. "We'll have a nice supper, get the paperwork out of the way, and you won't have to worry about any of it ever again." No, I surely wouldn't. Sunday came clear and cold, with that hard, bright light we get out here in the dead of winter. The kind of light that shows you the true shape of a thing, with nowhere left to hide. I'd gotten ready that morning, the way I used to get ready for a long day of hard work I knew I was equal to. I woke before dawn, in the quiet, and I did what I did every morning. I talked to Della, but that morning I meant it different. Not out of loneliness, but out of readiness. I told her it was the day. I told her I'd kept my name on the papers, the way she made me promise, and that today she was going to win through me, and that all I had to do was keep my hand steady a few more hours. And I swear I felt her hand on the back of my neck, the one that steadied the whole spinning world, even though it wasn't there. I stood at that fence a long while in the winter dark before the others woke. The way I've stood at that fence to think through every hard thing of my life, and I thought about the shape of the day coming. Not with fear. I'd run clean out of fear 2 years back in a bright little room, but with the particular steadiness you feel at the start of a job you've prepared for right. It's the feeling of a man who's checked his equipment and mended his fence and stacked his hay and looks up at a hard sky knowing the storm is coming and knowing he's ready for it. Everything was in its place. Fran and her folder, Beth, close by, ready to come. Cass and Investigator Sykes, ready. Gil's numbers, Ramon's notebook, the real evaluation, the forged title, their own words. The estate locked down tight, Wyatt safe and warned just enough. All of it prepared over a long, patient winter. And now, nothing left to do but let the day arrive and keep my hands steady through it. And I thought about how different this morning was from the morning after Della died, when I couldn't get up off an overturned bucket in the machine shed. That man could barely stand. This man had built, out of grief and patience, a thing that was about to hold against the worst his own son could bring. Same man, 2 years apart. That's what the patience buys you, if you can bear the weight. It turns the man who can't stand up into the man who's ready. And I swear I felt her hand on the back of my neck, the one that steadied the whole spinning world, even though it wasn't there. Then I got up, and I dressed in my good clothes, the ones I wore to church and to Della's funeral, and in my shirt pocket over my heart, I put a folded piece of paper, and I did my chores slow and calm in the winter dark and fed the stock, and stood a while at the fence looking out over the land as the sun came up on it, and I was not afraid. I felt the way you feel at the start of a day you've prepared for all your life. The work was done. All that was left was to see it through. They came at midday. Brett was expansive and warm, playing the devoted son to a full house. A couple of cousins there, a neighbor or two, brought in as witnesses without knowing that's what they were, so the record would show a loving family and a father giving his blessing. Amber fussed over me, touched my shoulder, called me Dad in that soft voice, her eyes shining with what everyone took for love, and I now knew was the taste of the finish line. And Wyatt sat down the table, quiet, watchful, pushing his food around. A boy who half knew and couldn't say. And I caught his eye once and gave him the smallest nod. "Steady, I've got it." And he swallowed and nodded back. Brett's lawyer, Rex Marlowe, was there too, in a good coat, with a leather folder, introduced as a friend of Brett's who could help with the paperwork. And I welcomed them all into my home, and I let them believe every bit of it, right up to the last minute, because a rancher knows the last of a thing is where it's won or lost. And I hadn't waited a whole winter to rush it now. We got through the supper and the toasts. Brett stood and raised his glass and gave a little speech about how brave I was, how this was the right thing, how Mom would be proud of how gracefully I was handling it, and everyone raised their glasses, and I raised mine, and I thanked them. And then, right on cue, as the coffee was poured, Marlowe slid his leather folder in front of me and set a good pen beside it, and Brett leaned in, warm and easy, and said, "Dad, let's just get this last bit of paperwork out of the way so it's all settled. It's nothing complicated. Just signs everything over so we can take care of it all for you. You don't need to read the whole thing. It's dry as a bone. Rex has been through it. Just sign at the bottom there, and it's done, and you never have to worry about the ranch again. You don't need to read the whole thing. Just sign at the bottom. There it was, the last move. 2 years of a machine come down to this. My son's easy voice. A pen. A paper he was telling me not to read. At a Sunday supper in my own house with witnesses he'd gathered himself. 60 years I worked this land, and never once signed a note or a lease I hadn't read to the last line. Because Della taught me, and my daddy taught me, and the land itself taught me. And here was my own son asking me to sign away 4 generations of Tolliver ground on a paper he was praying I wouldn't read. I looked at the folder, I looked at the pen, I looked at my son's warm, expectant face, and I picked up the pen. I watched Brett's breath catch with hope, and I set it back down, gently beside the folder, and I said, in a voice that was suddenly not soft at all, "You know, Brett, I've never in my life signed a paper I didn't read. 60 years. I'm not going to start today." And into the little silence that dropped over the table, there came the sound of tires on the gravel outside, and then boots on my porch, and then a knock at my door. Brett's smile flickered. "Who? Dad, are you expecting somebody?" "I am," I said. "Wyatt, would you get the door for your grandfather?" And Wyatt, my Wyatt, who I'd told just enough and trusted with the rest, got up from that table and walked to the door and opened it. And in walked Fran Cutler, my lawyer of 40 years, in her good coat, with a thick folder under her arm, and behind her came my daughter Beth, and the whole table went dead silent, and Fran looked around at my son and his wife and their lawyer with an expression I'd waited all winter to see, and she said, "Pleasant as you please. Afternoon, everyone. Sorry to interrupt your supper. Earl asked me to come out and read a few things to the family. It won't take long." And she pulled out the empty chair across from me and sat down and opened her folder, and my son's Sunday supper ended, though he didn't know it yet, right there. "What is this?" Brett said. It wasn't really a question. The warmth had drained out of him, and the whole table had dropped into that held-breath silence. Except this time, it wasn't falling on me. This time, it was falling on them. "Sit down, Brett," I said, quiet, because I have never in 60 years needed to holler to be heard. "We'll finish the supper, just not the one you planned. Sit and let Fran read a few things and let me settle this account. It's a thing I know how to do." And I watched my son do the thing I'd watched him do his whole life. Calculate, hunt for the angle, the smile, the easy words that had gotten him out of everything. And for the first time, he couldn't find one. There was a lawyer at his father's table, and a sister who was supposed to be a day's drive away, and something in the air that told even Brett a bad storm had come up fast, and he was a long way from shelter. He sat. I looked around the room a moment before Fran began. My land out the window in that hard, bright winter light, the folder waiting for my signature, the good pen, the cousins and neighbors frozen with their coffee going cold, Wyatt in the doorway, Beth beside Fran, the empty chair pulled out for a lawyer instead of a guest. And I thought of Della, who would have wanted to see this, and who in a way was seeing it, because every bit of what was about to happen she had made possible years before, with her hand over mine on the table. And I thought, here we are, Della, on our land. Let's see together what happens when a man finds out at last what his own son is made of, and what his wife was made of, which turned out to be the stronger stuff by far. "Fran," I said, "start with the land. Whose name is it in?" And Fran Cutler opened her folder, and in a flat, clear, merciless voice, began to read. She read the trust. She read the deed to all 600 acres. She read in plain words that filled my house and could not be unheard, the thing my son had spent 2 years never thinking to check, that the land, the house, the protected savings, all of it, were in the name of Earl Tolliver and no one else, held in a trust that only I controlled and could not be sold, mortgaged, transferred, or touched by anyone but me. I watched it land on Brett. I watched him understand at last that the 600 acres he had already sold in his head, the life raft, the answer to all his sinking deals, had never been his to sell and never could be. That the gate he'd been throwing himself against for 2 years, crueler and more frantic every month, right up to forging my name and calling a developer, had a name, and the name was his father, sitting quiet at the head of the table the whole time. And Marlowe, the lawyer, had gone very still, because a lawyer knows the sound of a locked door when he hears one read out loud. Brett tried then. Of course he did. He'd talked his way out of everything his whole life. And even now, even with a lawyer reading the deed and a badge on its way through the door, some animal part of him reached for the old smile. "Okay, hold on," he said, spreading his hands. Reasonable, warm, the salesman coming up through the panic. "This is a big misunderstanding. Dad, you've been confused about the finances. That's all this is. You signed things over to me to manage. That was your idea, remember? You asked me to help. Fran, with respect, you don't have the full picture here, and I don't think it's good for my father to be put through." And I let him get that far, because I wanted the whole room to watch him do it, watch him try to turn it, in the same breath, into me being confused and him being helpful. And then I said, "Quiet. Which is it, Brett? Am I so confused I need you to manage everything? Or am I sharp enough to have asked you to, of my own free will? You can't have me both ways, son. Pick one. Because your whole plan needed me to be too far gone to know what I was doing. And here I am, knowing exactly what you did, down to the dates. So, which Earl Tolliver am I? The one too addled to run his own ranch? Or the one who just caught you?" And Brett opened his mouth and shut it, because there was no answer that didn't hang him, and I watched him understand that the very story he'd built to take me, poor confused dad, was the story that proved I couldn't have knowingly signed anything over, and the trap he'd built had my name on it now, instead of his. And Marlowe, the lawyer, had gone very still, because a lawyer knows the sound of a locked door when he hears one read out loud. "Now the money," I said. "Fran?" And Fran read Gil Overby's findings, cool and unhurried, and it was the theft laid bare. The ranch skimmed for 2 years, the cattle sold off the books, the phantom leases, the money bled out of the operating accounts and traced, dollar by dollar, back to Brett, and out to Amber, and into the whole of Brett's dying deals. And then she read the dates, and when she said the date the skimming began, the week of Della's diagnosis, that Thursday, I saw Beth's hand go to her mouth, and I saw her turn slow and look at her brother with a horror that had no bottom in it, because she understood what it meant, that while she and I were losing her mother, Brett was already counting her mother's cattle. Wyatt had gone white. Amber had stopped breathing. Every figure Fran read was a fence post driven deep, and she set them all with the calm of somebody who doesn't need to swing hard, because the truth is, the mall and the truth drives itself. Then Fran laid down 2 more papers, side by side. The forged transfer on the truck title, my name signed in a hand that wasn't mine, and the deed to the ranch that Marlowe had drawn up, ready and waiting for the same treatment. "This one," Fran said, tapping the truck title, "is a forgery filed with the state, which is a felony all by itself, and which the DMV already flagged and turned over to the county. And this one," she tapped the ranch deed, "is the same thing, drawn up and ready, needing only a signature. Nobody at this table was ever going to get, honestly. The truck wasn't greed, Brett. The truck was a rehearsal. You wanted to see if forging your father's name would work on something small before you tried it on 600 acres. And Marlowe, hearing his own drawn-up deed read out loud beside a forged title with a badge already involved, did the thing men like Marlowe always do the second it gets real. He started backing away from his own client. "I drafted documents on my client's instructions," he said quickly, hands coming up. "The transfer was to be executed properly. I knew nothing about any forged title. That's the first I'm hearing." "Shut up, Rex," Brett said, low, and there it was, the real voice at last, the warmth gone for good. Then Fran set down the 2 doctor's notes. Dr. Slade's soft, examine-nothing note about my cognitive decline, the foundation of the whole guardianship, and beside it, my real evaluation, the full workup from an honest specialist who couldn't be bought, certifying in black and white that Earl Tolliver was completely sound. "Your guardianship petition rests on that first note," Fran said, "written by a man who never examined your father from what you told him. Beside it is a real, documented evaluation that says the opposite. You want to guess which one a judge credits, Brett, especially once the medical board hears how Dr. Slade came to sign the first one." And Beth spoke then, for the first time, in the flat, steady voice of a woman who'd spent 25 years catching people who write off the ones they find inconvenient, and she said, "I sat with Dad for a full day of real testing with a real specialist. There is nothing wrong with his mind, and there never was. You didn't need him to be slipping. You just needed a judge to believe he was, so you could take the land. I'll say that under oath, and so will a doctor who actually examined him. And then I did the last thing, the one that was mine to do, because it was the deepest cut and a father has to drive some posts himself. I reached into my shirt pocket over my heart and took out the folded paper I'd carried there for weeks, and I opened it and I laid it flat on the table. It was their own words, and I didn't read all of it. I read the part I'd carried. I read in my plain, steady voice to the whole table. Once we get the guardianship, the land sells, and every problem we've got disappears. He's too far gone to know the difference. Just keep the poor dad's story going. The truck was nothing. And I looked up at Amber, not the paper, and I said her part to her face. It's kinda sad how easy he is now, but that ground is worth a fortune, and he's just sitting on it playing rancher. It's wasted on him. And then Brett's last line, quiet into that silent room. Once he's at Cedar Springs and the deal closes, we won't even have to drive out there to see him much. I set the paper down, and the room was so quiet you could hear the wind in the cottonwoods out the window. You told me the truck was wasted on an old man, I said, into that quiet looking right at my son. And you were right about one thing. You were sure everything I had was wasted on me. The truck, the land, my whole life out here. All of it, wasted on an old man who was too far gone to know the difference. I let that sit a moment. But here's what you never once checked, son. In 2 years of measuring my land and forging my name and telling everybody I'd lost my mind, that truck was still in my name. And so is the land, and so is every last thing you were so sure was already yours. You said the old man was finished. You just never once bothered to look at whose name was on the paper. It was mine, Brett. It was always mine. It was mine the whole time you were laughing. And then the thing happened that always happens. The thing I'd counted on from the start. The thing greed does to people who only ever shared the greed and never anything else. Because the front door opened again, and in came Investigator Rhonda Sykes, quiet, in a plain jacket with her badge where everyone could see it, and a woman from Adult Protective Services behind her. And the second the law was plainly in the room, my son's alliance came apart in about a minute, because there is no loyalty among people who were only ever in it for themselves. There's just the cold arithmetic of who goes down worse if they don't sell the others first, and faster. Marlowe was already halfway to the door in his mind, already a witness for the other side, already offering his files. And Amber, my son's driver, the wind in his sails, took one look at that badge and those texts on the table and turned on Brett like a snake. This was his idea, she said, fast to the investigator, pointing at her own husband. The forgery, the doctor, all of it, that was Brett and that lawyer. I just went along with what he told me. Amber, shut your mouth, Brett hissed, but she was already scrambling for the lifeboat, and Brett sat there watching the person he'd wrecked his soul for hand him to the law to save herself, and something in his face finally broke. The salesman's smile gone for good. The whole rotten thing came down around Della's table in under 2 minutes. Everybody grabbing for whoever they could reach to keep their own head above water. I sat and watched it, quiet, the way you watch a badly built fence finally go over in the first hard wind. Brett came to me last when the grabbing had run its course and there was nothing left to hold. He turned to me, and the anger drained out and something desperate came up in its place, and he said, Dad, come on. We can. This is family. We can work this out. You don't want to do this to your own son. Think about what this does to us, to Wyatt. Think about... And there it was. My son reaching for the boy as a shield at the very end, and that was the thing that told me, more than the texts, more than the forgery, exactly how far he'd gone. And the whole room held its breath to see what the old man would do. I didn't shout, and I want you to understand this was the most important thing I did all day. My son wanted a scene. He wanted the old man's rage, something loud and ugly he could point to later, so he could tell himself and everyone else that this was just a family blowing up, a hard old father and a desperate son, and not what it actually was, a careful theft finally dragged into the light. I didn't give it to him. I gave him the truth instead, in the plainest voice I own. You don't get to say Wyatt's name to me as a shield, Brett, I said. Not you. You were going to sell his inheritance to a man who'd pave it and put me in a home, and you told your wife it was wasted on me. So don't you dare hold that boy up in front of you now. This isn't me doing something to my son. This is a harvest. A man reaps what he sows. It's the oldest law there is. older than any law with a badge behind it, and it never once fails. You sowed this, over 2 years, in the dark, the week your mother got her diagnosis. I didn't plant a seed of it. I just kept my name on the papers, the way your mother made me promise, and I waited for what you planted to come up. And now it's up, and you're standing in the field you sowed. I love you, son. I will always love you. I can't help that. You're mine. But I will never trust you again as long as I live, and you will never set foot on this land as its owner, because your mother saw what wanting had done to you, and she built a fence around this ground that you could not climb, from the grave. That's not me being hard. That's just the account, come due, on time, the way the land always pays it. He had nothing to say to that. For the first time in his whole smooth, certain life, my son opened his mouth and found it empty. Investigator Sykes stepped in then, quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it heavier and not lighter. There were things in the next hour I won't dress up for you. The forgery, the theft, the guardianship scheme, Dr. Slade's name going into the record, Marlowe's name going into the record, Brett and Amber answering for what they'd built, the careful machinery of the law beginning to turn against the people who'd built a machine to strip me bare. I'll spare you the procedure. What I'll tell you is that somewhere in the middle of it, I got up from that table and I went to find Wyatt, because Wyatt was still in the house. Of course he was. And he'd backed away from the table when the law came in, and now he stood out on the porch in the cold, 16 years old, white-faced, looking out over the land his family was coming apart inside of. And I went out to him, these old knees and all, and I stood beside my grandson at the porch rail, and I put my arm around him, and I said, I've got you. Whatever happens in there, you hear me? None of this is yours, and you and I are solid as bedrock. Come on, let's you and me stand out here a minute and look at the country. It's always steadier out here, looking at the land. It was here before all of this, and it'll be here after. And I stood with my grandson on the porch, looking out over 4 generations of Tolliver ground going gold in the winter light. And I let the law do its work inside without me. Some things matter more than watching justice get done. A scared 16-year-old at a porch rail mattered more than watching my son answer for himself. I have never once been sorry I chose the porch. I didn't walk away from that Sunday to nurse my wounds. In 60 years, I never once quit a hard job because it turned ugly, and I wasn't about to start at 78 on my own land, with everything finally in the open. And there was plenty of work left, because bringing my son down was never the point. That was just the moment the bleeding stopped. The healing came after, and the healing was the real work. The first thing to die was the thing they had built to bury me, the guardianship. Against my real evaluation, the full workup from a specialist who couldn't be bought, backed by a daughter who taught school for 25 years, and against the ugly picture of how their petition had been assembled, with a bought doctor and a 2-year seeded rumor and a forged title, the thing collapsed before it ever reached a courtroom. No judge was ever going to look at that and see a declining old man who needed a guardian. They'd have seen a sharp old rancher with a machine built to grind him. I stayed a free man, master of myself and my own land, and it was affirmed in writing. The very thing my son had spent 2 years and a forged signature trying to take. The money came back, most of what could be traced, the way it does when a forensic accountant and a patient investigator and an old foreman with a notebook all pull the same direction. The real prize, the 600 acres, the house, the protected savings, had never left my hands, thanks to Della, and never would. The cash Brett had skimmed off the ranch over 2 years, the law traced and clawed back what it could. And what came home, I put to work in a way I'll tell you about. And the developer, Grady Voss, the man who'd already spent my grandfather's ground on streets and lots in his head, got a call from Fran Cutler informing him that the seller had never owned what he was trying to buy, that the title to every acre was clean and locked and going nowhere, and that any further contact would be documented. He vanished the way those men do, the second the deal stops being easy. No more cards in the mailbox, no more men walking my property lines, gone like a dry weather friend the day it finally rains. I never heard from Grady Voss again, and I never will, because there was never anything there but a number, and the number stopped adding up the second he learned the seller didn't own the field. The land is still Tolliver land. It will be Tolliver land long after I'm gone, and there won't be one cul-de-sac on it, not one street named after the grass it paved over. My grandfather's ground stays grass, the way he broke it to be, the way it'll stay. And the truck came home. That's a small thing, in the middle of all of it, but I'll tell you it mattered to me more than it should have. Because of that forged title, the DMV business, once it was all sorted, the truck was confirmed for what it always had been. Mine, in my name, exactly the way it had been the whole time Brett was driving it around telling people it was his. And one afternoon, Cass Buckley drove it back up my lane and handed me the keys, my keys, and I climbed up into that cab that had buried the same wife I had, and I sat there a minute with my hands on the wheel, and then I drove it out across my own land in the winter light, slow, with the window down and my elbow out. And I'll be honest with you, I laughed. Not the way Brett laughed, a different kind of laugh. The kind a man laughs when a thing he loved comes home, and the account's been settled, and the land's still his, and his wife was right about everything. And doctor? Slade answered to the state medical board for a note he'd signed about a man he never examined, and I don't imagine he'll sign many more of those. And here's a thing that lets me sleep at night. Rex Marlowe, Brett's lawyer, the one who drew up that deed and would have filed a forged one without blinking, turned out to have helped other families do this kind of thing to other old people, and when one thread comes loose, the whole coat starts to go. Once Investigator Sykes started pulling, he answered for more than just me. That forged truck title, the little thing, the rehearsal, that was the loose thread. Pull a small enough thread hard enough, and the whole garment comes apart. Stopping the men who'd have done it again to somebody else's mother or father turned out to be part of what my patients bought, and that's a part I'm as proud of as any. Because I've come to understand, through the fund and through hearing from folks after, just how common this is, and how quiet. For every story like mine that comes out into the light, there are a dozen that never do. A dozen old people, alone at the end of a long road, or in a quiet apartment in town, being emptied out a little at a time by somebody who smiles and says family, and who never get a Ramon with a notebook, or a Beth to come home, or a Della who made them keep their name on the papers. They just get taken and called confused when they complain and move somewhere quiet and forgotten. It happens in nice houses and poor ones, in the country and the city, to sharp people and gentle people, because it doesn't prey on weakness of mind. It preys on loneliness and trust and love, which are not weaknesses at all, but the best things we've got. That's what makes it so cruel. It uses the finest things in a person against them. And most of the ones it happens to never even find out for sure, or find out too late, or find out and are too ashamed to say. So, when that one thread, a forged truck title of all small things, pulled loose a man who'd have gone on doing this to other people's parents, I counted that as one of the truest wins in the whole business. My land, I got back for me and for Wyatt, but shutting that door counted for people I'll never meet. And that felt like Della's work as much as mine. Stopping the men who would have done it again to somebody else's mother or father turned out to be part of what my patients bought. And that's a part I'm as proud of as any. The law took its time with my son, the way the law does. Slow, maddening, so slow I sometimes wondered whether I'd live to see the end of it. But the wheels grind all the way down, even when they grind slow and they don't run backward. The case was as clean as they come, Investigator Sykes told me, and she'd seen plenty, which is what happens when the victim kept his name on the papers, kept the real documents locked away, had a loyal foreman writing everything down for 2 years, and the guilty parties were foolish enough to forge a title and put their contempt in writing. There wasn't much of a fight. His lawyers looked at the mountain, the traced money, the forged title, the deed drawn up to forge next, the bought medical note against a real one, the guardianship scheme, their own words about warehousing their father and selling his land because it was wasted on him, and did the only sensible thing. Brett answered for the forgery and the theft and the fraud. The whole 2-year bleed came home to roost on him. Amber answered for her part in the exploitation and the fraud, though she talked fast and traded hard to lighten it. There were consequences, and there was restitution, and I won't walk you through every technicality because the procedure was never the point. I went to a hearing once and sat in the back on a hard bench in my good coat and watched a piece of my son's long-reaching end in a few flat sentences from a judge who'd seen 1,000 Bretts and had no patience left for any of them. And I felt no triumph, none, only a tiredness as old as the land itself. Because I was watching a whole life catch up to my own child all at once. And no father, not even a wronged one, is glad to see that land on the face of a boy he once taught to ride, who rode beside him in that truck with his boots on the dash, asking 100 questions about the country. Brett's marriage didn't survive it. and I don't know of many that would, when one spouse takes the fall and the other testifies to save herself. Inside, a year Amber was gone, and Brett was alone with what he'd done, in a house that had gotten very quiet. And I know something about a house that's gone quiet, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone, not even him. He came to me, eventually, stiff and unable to meet my eye, and asked, in so many words, whether I could ever forgive him. And I'll tell you what I told him, because it's true, and because I don't want you thinking this ends with a hard old man turned to stone. I told him yes. I told him I forgave him, that I laid the whole weight of it down, for my own sake as much as his, because I'm old, and I've buried the only person I'd carry that kind of weight for. And I will not spend what's left of my life dragging it around for my boy. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, and I told him that too. I forgave him freely. I will never trust him again. Not with $1, not with a signature, not with a key to anything I love. That gate is shut, and he shut it himself, in my own driveway, with a laugh and a set of keys and the word wasted. He has my forgiveness if he wants it. He does not have my trust. He spent that to the last cent, and it's the one account that can never be clawed back. But there was a piece of my son's wreckage I was not finished with, not by a long way. There was Wyatt, and there was the child of mine who'd never wanted a nickel of it and who deserved everything exactly because she never wanted it. There was Beth. When it was all over, and I sat down with Fran to decide how everything would be arranged, the land, the house, the money, the name, I did it with her reading me every line out loud, which is exactly how a thing like that ought to be done, and the exact opposite of how my son had tried to make me do it over Sunday supper. And the decisions weren't hard because for the first time in 2 years, I knew precisely who was who. Brett would never see an acre or $1 of what he'd tried to take, and the papers were written so it could never happen, no matter what. Ironclad, no gap for another Marlowe to work a finger into. But I didn't punish Wyatt for his father's sins, and I didn't punish Beth, who'd never wanted any of it and had proven exactly by not wanting it that she was the one who should have a say in it. I provided for Beth, my strong daughter, and the most important thing I gave her back wasn't money. It was the years, it was her father, and the truth about who'd kept us apart, and whatever time the two of us have left. Beth and I talk near every day now, and she comes out with her family when she can, and the years those two stole from us are the one thing in this whole story the law can't return. I grieve them, and I've stopped letting them make me bitter, because grieving what's gone and holding tight to what's left is the only way I know to be an old man without turning to leather. And then there was the land, and the ranch, and the Tolliver name on 4 generations of ground. Wyatt came to live with me, slowly, naturally, the way these things happen. First a few nights when his house got to be too much, then most nights, then it was simply home, with what blessing his mother could manage from where she'd ended up. Because even in her disgrace, Amber had the wit to see the boy needed what I could give him, and she, in that season, could not. And Wyatt came to the land in earnest, not the way he had as a boy, riding along for fun. He came as a hand and an heir both, up before dawn, learning it all the way you can only learn a place, with your body, across the seasons, one calving and one hay season and one hard winter at a time. And I taught him, Lord, the joy of teaching him, everything my daddy beat into me and everything 60 years added on top, how to read the weather in the cattle, how to pull a calf that's turned wrong, how to fix a fence so it holds through a blizzard, how to know a piece of ground the way you know a person, how to hold on to a thing across a lifetime of people trying to take it. Wyatt has the hands. Wyatt has the feel. He has the thing. You can't teach the love of a place that gets down in the blood, the thing that skipped clean past my son and landed whole in this boy who'd held himself together alone in a house going wrong. I had Fran write it into the papers, black and white. The land, the ranch, the house, the name, all of it would go to Wyatt, held safe until he's grown, but his. Not to someone who'd sell it to a developer for the price of the lots, but to a boy who'd keep the fences up and the herd going and would learn one hard season at a time why it takes 4 generations and a whole life to build a thing that isn't for sale at any price. The Tolliver place would stay Tolliver land, with a Tolliver on it who'd earn the name. Because Wyatt, when he was old enough to think about the life he wanted, told me he wanted this one. The dirt and the dawn and the dust. The hard, beautiful work of holding a piece of ground and handing it on. And I am not going to try to tell you what that did to an old man, because there aren't words for it. Only the feeling you get standing at a fence at sunup, looking at land you were afraid would die with you, and seeing a boy ride out across it who's going to keep it alive. They wanted to carve it into cul-de-sacs and warehouse me on my own dime. Instead, the fences are up. The Tolliver name is still on the ground, and there's a 16-year-old riding out at dawn with his grandmother's eyes and his own good heart. And here's a thing that closes the circle so neat I can hardly believe the Lord let it happen. That truck, the one Brett drove off in, laughing, the one that started all of it, I taught Wyatt to drive in that truck, out in the pasture, same as I taught his Aunt Beth, same as my daddy taught me. A boy grinding the gears and killing the engine and laughing and trying again, while an old man rode shotgun and pretended his heart wasn't full to breaking. The truck my son said was wasted on an old man is the truck my grandson learned to drive in, and it'll be his someday, along with the land and the name, and he'll haul hay in it and pull cabs in the headlights of it and drive his own wife around this land in it someday, God willing, long after I'm gone. Brett tried to take that truck and make it his with a forged signature, and it slipped right through his fingers. Wyatt will get it honest, handed to him by a grandfather who loves him, with the title clean and his name on it, the right way, the only way that ever holds. The thing my son tried to steal, my grandson will inherit. That's the whole story of this family in one old pickup, if you want it. What you grab at, you lose. What you're handed honest and love right, you keep. That's the final tally. On the things that actually count, my son took nothing at all. That left the question of the money that came home and what to do with it. And here I have to tell you about Della one more time, because what I did for her, and in her name. I didn't need it. I'm 78. The land is mine. The house is mine. My wants are few. A good sunrise, a horse under me a while longer, a boy to teach, a daughter's voice on the phone. I could have put the clawed-back money in the bank to sit there and do nothing, but it had been stolen with a particular kind of cruelty, the cruelty of somebody who goes after an old person exactly when he's most alone and most broken, and uses the words safety and family and love as the pry bar. And it seemed to me that money ought to go back to fighting that exact cruelty. So, with Fran I set up a foundation, and I named it for my wife, the Della Tolliver Fund. The fund does one thing, but it does it with all the stubbornness Della used to put into those kitchen table books. It helps old people who are being robbed by the very family that's supposed to protect them. And out here, in ranch and farm country, that most often means people about to lose their land, the ground their families broke and held for generations, to some slick relative and some waiting developer. It pays for lawyers like Fran and accountants like Gil and investigators like Cass for old folks who can't afford them. The ones who are alone and grieving and being quietly managed by somebody with a plan and a soft voice. It fights guardianship petitions filed in bad faith. The ones that aren't about protecting anybody, but about seizing everything. And it helps competent old people prove they're competent, which is the most humiliating thing that can be asked of a person. To have to prove your own mind is your own. And it teaches Della's rule, plain and hard, the rule of the finger tapping the kitchen table to anyone who will listen. Keep your name on the papers. Keep your land in your own name in a trust you control. Be as generous with your children as your heart tells you, but do not sign over control while you're alive and in your right mind. And keep your own eyes on your own affairs, because the day you go blind to them is the day somebody starts to measure your ground. A man who signs away his land signs away his grave. Della said that at a kitchen table, and now it goes out under her name to anyone who'll listen. And I'll tell you the thing I've come to understand about why so many of us old ones get taken. Because it might do somebody some good to hear it from a man who nearly lost everything. It isn't that we're stupid, it's that we're lonely and tired and gutted, and at a certain point somebody shows up with a warm smile and the word family and the word safe. And after months of a silent house at the end of a long dirt road, that warmth is so good you hold your hands out to it without once checking where the fire's really coming from. And there's worse underneath it, there's the shame. Because the moment you start to suspect that the child who says they love you is robbing you, the first thing you feel isn't anger, it's shame at thinking such a thing about your own boy. And the shame seals your mouth. It makes you say, I must be wrong, I'm just a bitter old man now. I can't think that about my own son. And while you sit there ashamed of your own suspicion, they work. The Della Tolliver Fund exists to tell those old people one thing before it's too late. Don't be ashamed to look. Looking isn't a betrayal of the people you love. Real love holds up under a clear eye. Only a swindle needs you to keep your eyes shut. Let me tell you about one man, because 1,000 numbers never say what one man says. His name was Roy. That's not his real name. And he was 82, a widower, a wheat farmer 3 counties over. And his son and daughter-in-law were doing to him exactly what mine tried to do to me. The concern, the let us handle it, the papers slid across the table to sign without reading. The remarks about his memory dropped in front of the neighbors, and finally, a petition to have him declared incompetent so they could sell his ground to a man putting up grain silos and warehouses. Roy came to the fund shaking, half convinced he really was losing his mind, because they'd told him he was slipping so many times, so gently, that he'd started to believe it. And that, believe me, is the cruelest part of the whole business. Convincing a sound man he's lost his wits so you can take everything he is, including the truth about himself. The fund put a real lawyer beside him, and a real doctor, and within a few months the petition collapsed and his land was safe. But that's not the part I keep. The part I keep is Roy's face on the day a judge dismissed the thing and told him, in front of his own family, that he was fully competent, that he wasn't slipping, that he never had been. I have never seen relief like it on a human face. He looked like a man handed back not his farm, but himself. And I stood in the back of that courtroom and thought of Della, and I thought, there, that's what the money was for. It was never mine. It was hers. And that's what she does with it now. From wherever she is, still keeping the books, still keeping our name on the papers, still looking after the ones nobody else will. And in the end, I went back to the land. That's the simplest part, and the best. I went back to the work, not the way I did at 40. At my age, you learn what to hand off. But the good work, the dawn rides, the calving, the standing at a fence at sunup, watching the light come up over ground, my family has held for 100 years. I went back to being a rancher instead of a man being managed toward a home. And every morning I climbed into that truck, my truck, and drove out across my own land. And I'll tell you, there is no finer feeling I know. And I began to teach, not just Wyatt, but others. There's a program that brings kids out to ranches, kids from town who've had a hard time of it, kids nobody's had the patience for, and I started taking a few on. Restless kids, angry kids, kids with nobody left to show them a slow thing done right in a world that's in a hurry about everything. And I'd put them on a horse and out on the land and teach them what my daddy taught me, and I'd feed them, because half of them had never once had an old man be glad to see them. And you'd be amazed what happens to a hard, closed-off kid the first time somebody hands him honest work and trusts him with it. There was one boy the program sent out, 15, all attitude, daring me to give up on him the way everyone else had. He left a gate open his first week, maybe by accident, maybe to see what I'd do. And half my herd got into the wrong pasture, and it took us the whole day to sort it out. And he braced for me to blow up, because getting hollered at was the only thing he'd ever known. And I didn't holler. We just spent the day putting it right, side by side, horseback, moving cattle. And along about the middle of it, sorting steers in the dust, the hard look started coming off his face, because I think it was the first time in his life a grown man had watched him mess up bad and answered by working beside him instead of on him. That boy comes out on his own now, weekends, sits a horse like he was born to it, fixed to make a hand someday. And a while back he asked me, shy, why I gave him a second chance after the gate, when everybody had told me he was trouble and not worth the bother. And I told him the truest thing I know about people and about land both. I said, son, you can't judge a field by how it looks the first hard year. I've seen ground everybody wrote off, come back rich as anything, once somebody had the patience to work it right. And I've seen ground everybody praised turn to hardpan, under a man who only ever took from it. People are the same. Most folks that everybody's given up on were just never once worked right. Never had a hand put honest work in front of them and trust them to do it. You weren't trouble. You were a field nobody'd bothered to tend. Turned out there was good ground under there the whole time. And that hard, closed-off kid had to look off at the horizon a minute before he could say anything back. Nobody had ever told him there was good ground under him. That's most of what these kids are missing, I've found. Not discipline, not a talking to, but one grown person who will look at the mess of them and say, There's good ground under here, and mean it, and hand them a real job to prove it. And somebody asked me once why I bothered at my age, after everything my own son did, why I'd spend what's left of me on other people's hard luck kids. And I told them the truest thing I know. I said, a piece of land, a trade, a way of working. It's how you tell a person they're worth handing something to. My own boy looked at 4 generations of me, holding this ground, and saw a sale price. Every kid I teach to sit a horse and read the weather and love a piece of dirt is my answer to that. It's me saying no. It wasn't wasted, it was never wasted. A life gets handed on, not carved up and sold. That's the thing the people who only count what a thing is worth never understand. The things that are actually worth anything don't have a price. They have heirs. Let me tell you about one Sunday this past year, because it's the answer to that other Sunday, the one with the folder and the pen and the paper I wasn't supposed to read. It was a supper again, at my house, at Della's kitchen table, but the table was different. Beth was there, in from her town with her family, laughing with her head thrown back exactly the way her mother used to. Wyatt was there, 17 now, ropey with ranch muscle, arguing happily with his aunt about whether a certain draw floods every spring or just most springs, an argument that could only be settled by 20 more years of watching it, which is the whole of ranching in one sentence. There was food I'd had a hand in, beef off our own place, and Della's cornbread recipe that Beth makes now. That tastes almost right, close enough to break your heart. And halfway through it, I had to get up and go, stand at the window a minute, looking out at the land going blue in the dusk, because some kinds of happiness are too big to sit still with at a table. There was an empty chair. I didn't set it on purpose. It's just that when you lay a table for family, your hands count the old number. And there was one chair too many, and that chair was Brett's. And he wasn't there, and won't be. And I'll tell you something honest about that empty chair, because I've looked at it a good deal. I don't feel hatred when I look at it. Hatred is heavy, and I'm old, and I've buried the only person I'd carry that kind of weight for. And I won't spend the years I've got left dragging one around for my son. But there's no place set for him either, because here's what I learned. The thing it took me 78 years and my own boy driving off in my truck to understand all the way down. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. They sit side by side, so people confuse them. But they run on different ground. I can forgive a man. I can lay the weight down. I can even hope, somewhere far underneath, that he finds his way to being better than he was. And at the very same time, never trust him again. Never seat him at my table again. Never hand him a key to anything I love. Forgiveness is something you do to set yourself free. Trust is something a person earns or spends, and once it's spent the way Brett spent his, a son forging his father's name and calling his father's life wasted, it doesn't come back at any price. And there's a thing about that empty chair I want to say for Wyatt, because someday he may see this story told, and he deserves the truth said with care. Brett is his father and will always be his father, and I have never said one word to Wyatt to turn him against him. I did the exact opposite of what was done to Beth and me. I did not poison the boy's ear against anyone. I told Wyatt only the plain truth of what happened when he was old enough to bear it, and then I left him free to love his father as much as his own heart needs to, without shame, without me sitting in judgment of it. Because a child has the right to love a parent even when that parent hasn't earned it, and to take that right away would be to do to Wyatt the very thing that was done to us. The empty chair isn't a rebuke aimed at Wyatt. It's just the plain fact of something that broke, and out here we don't hide the broken things. A downed fence, a dead calf, a son gone wrong. We look at them square in the hard morning light, and then we do the work in front of us and go on. If Brett ever becomes a man you can hand a key to again, Wyatt will have my blessing to hand him one. But not to this land, and not with papers in his hand. That lesson I paid too much for to forget. And I think about fathers and children, and the ones you're given versus the ones who show up, sitting there looking at that empty chair. For years I ached because Beth didn't want the ranch, my name, my land, and I warmed myself at the son who seemed so ready to step in close. And I had it exactly backwards. The child who walked away to build her own life loved me enough to come home and take apart the machine that was eating me alive. The one who wanted my land wanted it only to sell it off for lots. It isn't the child who wants your inheritance who loves you. It's the one who treated it the way you treated it. I learned that almost too late, and I carry the almost like a splinter under a nail. But almost too late means in time. and in time is all a man can ask for. So, let me tell you what this whole thing taught me. From the seat of an old rancher who thought he'd already learned everything a man needs to know, and found himself, at 76, back at school with grief and betrayal for teachers. I learned that the loudest man in the room is almost never the one holding the deed. My son was smooth and certain and warm when it suited him, and he filled every room with his sureness that he'd already won, and he had nothing. I was quiet and slow and beaten-looking, and seemed to have nothing, and I held everything, because a woman 2 years in her grave had made me keep my name on the papers. Don't let the noise fool you. Look at who actually holds the paper. Always look at who holds the paper. I learned that patience isn't weakness, even though it wears the same coat, and that's exactly why impatient people mistake it for weakness and throw themselves onto it and break their teeth. I spent a whole winter playing the tired old man about to give up the ranch, swallowing my pride at every supper, feeding a folder in the next room. Not because I was weak, because the patience of the land is the sharpest tool there is. You put the seed in the cold, dark ground and wait. And everyone who doesn't farm swears nothing's happening. And all the while the root is taking hold, and come the season, it holds against any wind. They thought I waited because I couldn't act. I waited because I knew exactly when to, and not one day before. I learned that you reap what you sow, and that it's not a saying, it's a law, as sure as gravity and the turning of the year. My son sowed 2 years of theft and lies and contempt in the dark, thinking nothing would ever come up. It came up. It always comes up. You can plant a thing in secret, but you cannot keep it from growing, and you cannot choose the season it comes ripe. And one day, you're standing in the field you sowed, whether you meant to plant it or not. I didn't do anything to Brett. I just kept my name on the papers, and I waited for his own crop to come in. And I learned the difference between what a thing is worth and what a thing is. My son looked at 600 acres and saw a sale price. He looked at 4 generations of Tolliver ground and saw house lots. He looked at that truck and saw a used pickup wasted on an old man. He looked at me and saw a problem to be filed away in a home on my own dime. He spent his whole life counting what things are worth, and he ended with nothing. Because a man who only counts what things are worth never owns anything that's actually worth anything. The things that count don't have a price. They have a name on a deed, and a boy with the right hands to ride out at dawn, and a piece of ground that outlasts every man who ever tried to take it. You can take a man's truck. You can't take his name off the paper. You said it was wasted on an old man, son, and you never once checked whose name was on the title. And it was mine, the whole time you were laughing. Keep your name on the papers. That's the whole of it. That's what a woman told a tired rancher at a kitchen table, with her finger on the wood, and it's the truest thing I ever learned in 78 years of learning things the hard way. The fence held. The way a fence holds when it's set deep and built honest, through the hardest wind the season can throw. And I learned one more thing, maybe the strangest of all, and I'll give it to you because it might be the most useful. I learned that being underestimated is a kind of power, if you've got the patience to use it instead of the pride to waste it. My whole life, being underestimated made me angry. The bankers who looked down their noses, the town men who figured a rancher was slow, the son who decided his old man was finished. And in this, for the first time, I stopped fighting it and started using it. I let Brett think I was beaten. I let Amber think I was helpless enough to need my meat cut. I wore the very smallness they had decided I had, like a coat. And I did all my real work underneath it, where they'd never think to look, because they'd already decided there was nothing there to see. A man they'd written off can move freely, because nobody watches a ghost. Every day they underestimated me was a day I got more done. So if you're old and you feel the world writing you off, I know how it burns. I do. But there's a gift buried in it, if you're patient enough to dig it out. Let them think what they think. Do your quiet work underneath. And be there, steady and clear-eyed, on the day they finally look up and realize the old man they wrote off has been holding the only key the whole time. The fence held. The way a fence holds when it's set deep and built honest through the hardest wind the season can throw. Della, you were right. About all of it. About him, about them, about the children, about that one small stubborn thing you made me do at the kitchen table with your hand over mine. I kept my name on the papers, my love. I kept it to the end, and it held everything. You always could find the one line in the ledger that came out in our favor, no matter how bad the year. and you found it one last time, from 2 years in the ground, and the line read, "His name is still on the papers, and because of that, so is everything else. The land, the name on the deed, the boy at the fence, the truck in the yard, and me in it, driving out across ground that's still ours." If you've come this far with me, and if there's an old person in your life, or if the old person is you, take the one thing that matters out of all of this, the kindness that can't be refused, the help that always seems to come holding a paper to sign, the child who says a thing is wasted on you. Look at it hard. Most of the time, it's just love, thank God. And if that's what you find, get down on your knees and be grateful, because that's the richest thing there is. But sometimes it's a gate closing behind a softer voice, and the only way to tell the difference is to keep your eyes open and your name on the papers and your own hand on every document before you sign it. Trust the people who beg you to read. Be careful of the ones who tell you not to trouble yourself. It's the simplest thing I know, and it saved my land. And I learned it from a woman who kept the books at a kitchen table and loved a stubborn rancher for 54 years. Thank you for staying to the end. If any of this rang true, if you've stood in your own driveway and watched somebody drive off with a piece of your life, or if you're watching it start to happen to somebody you love, then do the small, unglamorous things that actually hold. Find out whose name is on your papers today, while it's easy and nobody's rushing you. Read every line before you sign it, and be careful of anyone who tells you not to bother. Keep the real documents where only you can reach them. And write down what you see, the way Ramon wrote it down, because a quiet record kept over time beats a loud man every time it matters. Those are the fences, and they hold. Go check your papers. And if you can, go sit an hour with somebody old and alone, not with anything to sign, just to sit and let them tell you about their land or their life or the person they lost. Because loneliness is the gate that people like my son come through, and sometimes the only lock you need is somebody who shows up for the right reason. And if you're the old one, the one being managed and moved along and told your life is wasted on you, hear this from a man who was right where you are and came back. You are not finished. Not while your name's on the papers, not while you can still ride out at dawn across ground that's yours. And if you hold somebody tonight, let it be one of the ones who'd hold the gate for you in a storm, not one who'd laugh in your driveway and drive off with your life. My son took my truck and told me it was wasted on an old man. In the end, the old man's name was on the title, and on the land, and on all of it. And the boy who will have it after me isn't the one who wanted to sell it. It's the one who wanted to keep it alive. That's the only inheritance worth leaving, and it's the one thing my son could never take and never understood and never will. He spun my keys and laughed the way a man laughs at the dead. "That truck's wasted on you, old-timer," and drove off down my lane. I didn't say a word. I let him go. I turned my head and watched the dust and waited on the land and on the rain. He forged my name to make it his. The DMV called, and that small thread pulled hard, unstitched the whole design, the deed, the doctor, the developer, the wall he threw himself against for years, not seeing it was mine. Della, at the table, your finger on the line. Keep your name on the papers, Earl. A man who signs away his ground has signed away his grave. You knew. The sign still stood 2 years past your last breath, holding all the lines. The fences hold. The herd comes up the draw at dawn. The truck's back in the yard. The name's still on the deed. There's a boy who'll ride this ground long after I am gone. My last, best crop, and the only kind that ever grew from need. He's no fool who works a land for 80 years, nor he who waits. The owner's the one with his name, and the patience, and the proof. Time keeps the ledger straight and squares the old estates. To me, it left the land. To him, the harvest of his truth.